And so his instinct was, we got to help them. You guys stay here. The rest of you follow me. We're going to run up to the high ground. So off they all run up this spur. And this is in the opening minutes. It took them we believe about 4 to 5 minutes to get up there. Pat Tillman grabbed his guy, who is, the private at the time, and said, hey, let's go help our boys out and let's go kill some bad guys.
Welcome to Combat Story. I'm Ryan Fugit, and I served Warzone tours as an Army attack helicopter pilot and CIA officer over a 15-year career. I'm fascinated by the experiences of the elite in combat. On this show, I interview some of the best to understand what combat felt like on their front lines. This is Combat Story. Today we hear a unique combat story about the events that took the life of Pat Tillman, the soldier, ranger, and former NFL star in Afghanistan in 2004, thanks to the painstaking research, writing, and interviews by a former guest and former longtime unit commander and operator Pete Blaber, who served in Iraq, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Somalia, Colombia, and Panama. Pete twice served in the same Ranger Battalion that Pat Tillman was a part of, and as such, knows the people, the locations, and the weight of responsibility as a battlefield commander and common sense leader better than anyone. Mary Tillman, Pat's mother, asked Pete to help her find the truth about Pat's death, which, as many will recall, was a roller coaster of information, ranging from a heroic Pat being killed by the enemy to a friendly fire incident. After 4 unclassified and redacted investigations provided by the military about the event, Mary still did not feel she had the truth. What Pete was able to piece together provides a more accurate account of what actually happened, bringing some peace of mind to Mary, but also to several of the Rangers involved in the incident who were scapegoated by the chain of command and had to carry the twin burdens of guilt and frustration for 19 years, unnecessarily so. Pete documented the event to include the toxic leadership climate and decisions surrounding it in his book, Common Sense Leadership Matters: Toxic Leadership Destroys a Case Study. It's a phenomenal read that provides new perspectives on this tragic event, more context about the stand-up leader that Pat Tillman was in uniform, including his own journal entries, which I found fascinating, the Special Operations Community's organization and approach to fighting in 2004, and a perspective of what a day in the life of a Ranger can look like in the chaos that is combat. What's even better, you can go to firefight.commonsenseway.com to get images of the terrain and battlefield to follow along during the interview. And with that, I hope you enjoy this front row seat to a very moving, insightful, important, and real story of what happened to an American hero and his fellow Rangers, as told by one of the best, as much as I did. Pete, thanks for taking the time to come back on the show and share another story with us today.
Great to be here, Ryan. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's so good to have you back on. For those who have listened and they caught our last episode, it was our episode number 73. We're up to 140 now, and we've had over 150,000 people watch that interview with you, Pete, from that first session. And no surprise that the next time you come on, it's to tell somebody else's story. I'm not surprised by that at all with you. I know you've written several books, but I was hoping for those who maybe didn't catch the first episode or who may have forgotten some of your bona fides. Obviously, a long time with the Rangers, you were at the unit, but I'd love for you to just share a little bit more context, because I think it's really important the way that you are able to dig into the story we're about to get into.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Ryan. I was born and raised in Oak Park, Illinois, family of 9. Fantastic upbringing, like anyone growing up in America. And, I appreciated it the whole time. I'll bring this up because it'll tie into some of the guys in the story. I didn't know much about the military. I always knew I loved the military, but Illinois, there's no Army posts around. My dad wasn't in the military. And so, for me, a defining moment was the Iran hostage rescue mission when it went awry in 1980. And I was I believe that was my last year of high school. And it just had an effect on me. I couldn't get it out of my head. I was, troubled by it, that 8 men, died in the middle of the desert, trying to rescue whatever it was at the time, 60-something Americans. The most troubling part was that it failed. It created an embarrassment in me, and I couldn't watch the news for a couple of weeks. And because I couldn't believe it happened, and I couldn't believe that we failed a mission like that on the world stage. And so again, not knowing much about the military, I followed it. I learned a lot of the lessons learned from it, and I just decided during that time, hey, I've had this amazing life. I was now in college, Southern Illinois University, and loving life down there. I was a long distance runner, so I'm running every day, and I just came to the conclusion I got to pay something back and serve the country. So I started talking to recruiters and ended up signing up for OCS. You go through basic training, then go to OCS, and then your follow-ons after that. And so I joined the military. I served in Korea, then I did that, so I go right to the Ranger Regiment. 2nd Ranger Battalion was my first duty. I stayed there for 4 years. Fantastic assignment. In the book we're going to talk about, the first chapter is my experience there, and it's used to convey what a healthy leadership climate looks like. And it turned out to be the healthiest leadership climate of my whole career. And because it was so foundational to me, I would emulate it at every single duty station I went to after that. And trying to pay back again, the incredible behaviors of the leaders above me, how much they taught me, and how much they paid attention and led by example while I was there. So after that, I commanded a company in Fort Ord, California, 7th Infantry Division. Again, unbelievable group of soldiers, unbelievable tour of duty. And I finished that right away. And as soon as I finished, the next month, I went to selection for the unit, and I made it. And that was 1991. And I stayed in the unit from 91 all the way to really the end of my career in 2005. But in between, I went back one more time to the 2nd Ranger Battalion as a major to be an S3. And again, that's part of the infantry progression. But also, I went to pay something back. The regimental commander at the time, Bill Lazinski, asked me to come back, and I was like, yeah, I will. I want to come back. I want to pay something back to the Ranger Regiment. So I did for 2 years, but I ended my career at the unit at Fort Bragg, and went out, worked for 10 years in biotechnology as an executive, and then left that to really write these last 2 books. I just couldn't do it in my while working my day job. It was I just didn't have the time, and I knew I needed to do a lot of research. So I left to write these, and never looked back from there.
Perfect. And yeah, like we dug deep into your career in our first interview. We talked about your time with the Rangers, with the unit, including one of the events it comes up tangentially in this book, which we'll get into here in a moment. But in 2003 in Iraq, I believe, there's an overturned tank that you refer to in this book. But for people who are interested in Pete's career, that's the interview you want to go to. So with that, you mentioned these books with the focus on common sense leadership, right? So the one that we're about to talk about and dig deep into is Common Sense Leadership Matters. Toxicity, what is it? Toxic Leadership Destroys a Case Study. But could you also share the progression of books? Like, which ones did you want to write? Why did you write these books before we dig into the one that we're going to spend the rest of the interview on?
Yeah, no, and it's a great question. One that, I haven't thought about much, but the first one for sure was just, I never walked around while I was in the military thinking I was going to write a book. I didn't even think when I got out I was going to write one. But as I got out in 2005, 2006, most of my friends were still in. So I was living, through my conversations with them, listening to them every time they came back. I was still going to Bob Marshall and Summers and talking around the campfire. And right off the bat, I was taken back by the fact, we were in our 5th year of the global war against terrorists, and we weren't, it wasn't the new way, like we kind of thought, during the Afghanistan invasion. It's like, hey, there's a new way we're going to fight using common sense. And, I certainly believed it because we did in those first months. But, we weren't learning anything. And same mistakes were happening again. Especially things like always listen to the guy on the ground. We were ignoring the guy on the ground. It was getting harder to even talk to him because we were building headquarters on top of headquarters in Afghanistan and Iraq. When historians ask you questions about a headquarters, you're like, I don't even know what that is. And they're like, you don't? That was the headquarters, that was one above you. And they're like, yeah, never heard of it. Because there were so many of these hierarchies, and it's a negative habit that comes out in, the book, Common Sense Leadership Matters. We've got to do away with these massive disconnected hierarchies because they are a big part of the problem. And so that drove me to just take these simple, guiding principles that I learned all through my career, but especially they were especially relevant in Afghanistan because Afghanistan was when we were on the ground at that early phase in December, January 2001, 2002, there was only 500 Americans, of just less than 500 Americans, interagency group. There were a decent number of agency ground branch, but most of us on the ground were either special mission units or special forces. And there was no plan, there was no chain of command. We were there. And so we just kind of said, hey, what do you do? How do you organize when you don't know how to organize? And we got together, we talked about it, and we came up with these concepts. Let's build cross-functional pilot teams. Let's put them out in the key areas of the country where we think we have the highest potential to find the enemy, which was, Osama bin Laden and his lieutenants at the time. And we did it, and we pushed all of our assets out. I had a pretty decent headquarters made up of commo guys and intel guys, but we pushed all those out to the pilot teams. So they were these very high functioning teams that were out on the frontier, developing the situation, meeting people, talking to people, figuring out the lay of the land around them, and then passing in intel back and forth, not just to me, but through all the other pilot teams. And so, I wanted to capture that. I wanted to capture those lessons learned, and you just sort of develop the situation. That was the mission I gave to that entire group. Always listen to the guy on the ground, humor your imagination. Everyone who's been to combat knows that's a principle anyway, but we never talk about it. So that's why I wrote that first book. And then I wrote it and I felt, great about it. Went back working full time. You got to keep the lights on. And I worked, another 8 years in the corporate world. But while I was there, I kind of went through the same, journey. We were doing things, we were successful in certain areas, but no one wanted to learn any of the lessons. And most of them were the same type lessons, that I learned in the military. And there was something else about it. It struck me from the very first day I arrived in this $30 billion company. I sat in a meeting and the vice president got up and she started saying, okay, the purpose of this meeting is we got to plan the launch of this new molecule. And the way we're going to do it is we got to get a foothold on the beachhead. We got to do pre-assault fires. And then we got to get people in on the beachhead and expand out. And, I'm just sitting there going, first off, the funny thing about her, which I still remember, she looked exactly like the deputy chief of station in Budapest, who I had been dealing with like 6 months earlier. And she was a great deputy chief of station. But she looked just like her. So I'm looking at her as she's talking about, grabbing.
Was she using those terms, Pete?
Yeah. You see, and one of the takeaways is that when you jump from, government to military to business, you realize everybody uses metaphors to describe what they're doing. And, in business, they use military and sports metaphors. Sports uses military. Much of military metaphors are sports metaphors, as you know. And, a lot of people use all three of them. But the takeaway was people are people, no matter where you go. And, that was my first hint that there was something more here. And that kind of brought me to, why are we really all the same? What are we missing? That it's just the situation and the culture that changes us. And that got me on, common sense, because, already the unit teaches you that common sense is the central organizing principle of the unit. Everything's about common sense. That's your strategy. That's your plan is based on that. The way you treat your people is based on common sense. So, you survive by using common sense. And the unit teaches you that, so you know it. But what I found, when I was in the corporate world in this moment was, I've been using this for my whole career and I don't even know what it actually means. So I started researching what common sense actually means. And I, was initially surprised to find that both science and philosophy kind of stiff-arm science, common sense. They don't define it. They don't care. They don't really recognize it as something.
Yeah.
So I thought, I'm at a biotechnology company with a bunch of scientists. I'm going to start my research and find out what common sense is, and why it's the common ground and common language of people all across the planet. And that's what I started doing. And as the insights started coming out, I was putting them into practice. I had a massive sales organization at the time, like 120 people working for me, spread all across the US. And, so different geographies. And, I could tell that common sense was the best strategy even for that. So as I'm learning all these new things about common sense, that common sense is really just, refers to the common way we humans make sense, which is through our senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. And by understanding that, you can understand why it's the common ground, because if we all make sense the same way, it makes sense that we use that sensory information as the common language, across all spectrums of human existence. And that's why anywhere you go, what matters to people is safety and security, health and happiness, family and friends. It's the same, foundation of knowledge that drives all of us. And the more I learned, like I said, the more I put it into practice, had unbelievable results there. And then I just came to this conclusion: hey, I gotta, memorialize this. I gotta put it out for other people. And I knew, how hard it was going to be. And I just, at that point, I, asked the company if I could do a sabbatical, and they said, yeah, take as long as you need. And, 1 year turned to 2, 2 to 3. And I left the company, just to continue to write. And,
Wow.
And so that's what the Common Sense Way came out. It was while I was writing the Common Sense Way that I had this discovery, that by reading Krakauer's old book about Tillman, I had this discovery that our paths had crossed, that he was in Baghdad International Airport, when I talked to those 3 NCOs. And so I didn't even know he was in 2nd Ranger Battalion at the time. I didn't, I had no idea. And I don't know what that would have changed if I had, but I didn't know it. And so as I started talking to retired Rangers, they were telling me about his mom, that she was still looking into all of this. And I realized, well, I have a duty to call her. And so I called her just to tell her, a number of NCOs from Pat's unit came to me 1 year before he died. and said it was, they had a bad toxic leadership climate. And I don't know if this will help you at all because he died a year later, but I felt compelled to tell you that. And this is where retrospectively I realized how wise she is. She realized from the story, first, he's kind of in. Second, she still wanted someone to make sense of those documents. And she realized, I'm an ex-Ranger. I'm an ex-unit guy. I've been all over that area of Afghanistan. So I know the terrain, the tribes, and she had read my book, that first book, The Mission of Men and Me, and she really liked it. And she later told me, when reading that, I knew you'd take care of your people. So that's why I wanted you to come do this. And so she asked me, can you take a look at everything and tell me what you think? And that's what set off my journey to write this third book.
So this third book, it's funny because as I talk to people that I'm, before the interview, what's the book about? And you mentioned Tillman, right? So Pat Tillman, and we'll get into who he is for those who might not know, but obviously a storied career. But it's more than that. It's a leadership book. It's about right and wrong. It's about common sense. It's for people who just enjoy military history. It is a deep dive into a very specific operation, into how we were task organized at certain points and how we moved. Like, it's got something for a lot of folks. And I think the key here is it's a case study, which it says in the title. So it's really like about the lessons learned, but you can get a lot of the personal stories about the people, the experience, the leadership, all in this. So with that, maybe we could, if you wouldn't mind, Pete, like, who's Pat Tillman to people who don't know this?
Yeah, well, he's an American patriot who grew up outside San Jose, California. Much like I describe my life, I think he would describe his similarly. He had a great life, in that area. Fantastic place to grow up. He was very good at sports, very good at football and baseball. Chose football, a little bit undersized, but he never let that dissuade him or detour him. He, was super fast, super competitive. But, anytime I start going into his athleticism, I always have to come back to his aptitude and, what a thinker, deep thinker he was, because even in high school, he got great grades, which for most of us, we realize that alone is, shows he was an exceptional young man, because a lot of us our brains aren't developed enough to do well in high school. And he did. But he was a reader, constantly, educating himself and expanding his knowledge base. He got a scholarship to Arizona State University, went to school there, starred, took the team, all the way to the Rose Bowl, I believe in his second year, and were undefeated. So he set records on tackling, just already standing out. But at the same time, building this friendship network. He was liked by all his professors. I believe he graduated cum laude, which in 3 years, which again, amazing. And, you'll hear a lot, hey, he gave up a $3.6 million contract to join the military. And, that is important because, again, for anybody, if you just put yourself in shoes, even as a patriot, if there was also an option to go make $3.6 million, you have to question if your patriotism could have overridden that. And I don't know if mine could have, because that was an unfathomable amount of money to me in my early 20s. And so, I just couch it that way. But it's important to do it that way because you have to start with Pat Tillman from what he did and the magnitude of that. And it's not just we all know he joined after 9/11. These are the same patriots that joined after Pearl Harbor. They joined, for me, I just told you my story. I joined after the Iran hostage rescue mission went awry. But these individuals who joined after 9/11, these are America's greatest natural resource. These are our patriots who have no problem raising their hand and going out and, standing their ground to protect our freedoms. And the rest of us, many of whom, have no interest in protecting others or risking their lives to protect freedom. So what he did was a huge thing. And a number of the other guys in the platoon were the same boat. Two of the guys in the lead Humvee joined after 911 also. So, he really, and in the book, I treat him that way. He was a Ranger, and that's what he came to do. He wasn't doing it just to, come in and make it look good on his resume in the future. He was doing it because, that was who he was. He had, a number of his relatives who had served in the military, but you can go back and look at the videotape of him explaining it. And he only did it once because he didn't want to be exploited. But even when you watch the video, you just see the common comments of all patriots. They're moved by what happened. They're very serious about it, very solemn, and they just, without any drama or histrionics, they say, so, I'm going to go join and pay something back. And that's what he did. And, he was a really good guy. There's a book by one of the Rangers, Stephen Elliott, that's a very good book. He writes about, he's a private. He came in after Tillman. So Tillman's outranks him by, I think that's when Tillman was a E4. So he came in when he was a private. But even then, in the book, one of the most memorable parts of his book is how, Tillman came up to him and no one's talking to him. And he said, hey, man, what's up? What do you need? And as soon as I read that, I was like, wow, this is a common sense leader. It's just a good guy in the military, to be in the military, to be all he can be. And that's the way he was. And thank you for asking it, because that's why the book is so important too. Guys like that, our most precious natural resource, raise their hand and join the military, and they don't really know what they're getting into. None of us did or ever will, because that's being driven by politicians, 50 levels above us. But it underscores the responsibility that leaders have to these individuals. There's a contract that we're making with everyone who joins, and that contract is, you come in and risk your life, we'll take care of you. We will make sure we do everything we can to ensure your orders make sense, that you have everything you need to accomplish them. And if anything goes wrong, we'll be there to help support. And what happened here was that contract was broken. That did not happen for either Pat or the rest of the patriotic Americans who were members of that platoon.
And it's so hard to see. Obviously, for those who don't know what happened, and we'll get into it, but Pat Tillman is killed in this mission you're referring to, the lead Humvee, and we'll dig into this. But he's killed. There's an Afghan that's killed there, and then two wounded in addition, Pete, if I get that right. And subsequently, because of his notoriety, obviously there was quite a lot of press around his death. There were 4 investigations that the military ran that were later unclassified and or redacted to some degree. But I think it goes back. We got to talk about his mom again, Mary, who that wasn't enough for her, right? And I think we see the doggedness and probably the personality of Pat come out in Mary a little bit.
Yeah,
but maybe you could share, like, she just wouldn't take no for an answer, basically.
Right. Yeah, she's, editorial comment. She's an amazing person who, what she said to me initially explains her whole outlook. She said, if it was me who was killed instead of Pat, I know he would never rest until he found the truth. And, she had me right there when she said that. And as I say in the end of the book, as the son of an amazing mom myself, I I believe Pat would have been incredibly proud of her and, incredibly grateful for her vigilant, never take another no for an answer, keep digging until she finds the truth. And she did. And it took almost 20 years to come out of that. But in that time, it was, a lot of sorrow, pain, and everything else. The other thing about her is even in the beginning, when she had every reason to be, hate the world and hate everything in it, she was, incredibly kind and conscientious toward the members of the platoon. And a number of them reached out to her, most of them out of frustration. They saw what was going on. They couldn't believe, what we were telling the family, the difference between that and what they saw. And remember, these guys were never able to get all the information either. So they never fully understood a lot of the stuff in the book, what was happening behind the scenes, what their command was saying behind the scenes, the ridiculousness of their choice making at every phase of that, the day where Pat died. But she would talk to him and she would counsel him. And at least two of them told me that, when I asked them, hey, how'd you get through it? And one of them left the Rangers right after they briefed the family and joined the unit where he spent his final 16 years and did unbelievable stuff there. But he left because of that. And as he left, he said, I'm calling the mom. And he called Mary Tillman, and he told me, as he's reading the book, he said, one reason I think I was able to escape without any of the psychological damage is because I talked to her. And she gave me part of the investigative documents. Yeah, I said something and she said, no, that's not what happened. And he said, how would you know that? And she gave him. So he was one of the only guys to be able to read, what was really happening, at least for a short amount of the operation, the firefight. And he said to me, that's why I think I'm okay. And there were a couple other individuals the same way. Sergeant Major Brian O'Neill also talked to her right after. He's, next to Pat when he died. And he says the same thing. She was a saving grace for me. And, he went through the same battle with demons as everybody else. And but he came out. He was able to handle it while on active duty and come out the other side. But she just been an amazing source of counsel, logic, and kindness to these guys. And so in the last 9 months, I ended up talking to most of the guys who I had a hard time finding or that I hadn't talked to in these last 9 months. That's where everything from the recon platoon on has started happening. And as it was happening, I would tell guys, in the conversations I had with them, hey, I talked to Pat's mom, 3 times a week, and here's what she said. And they all said the same thing. Hey, could you any way you could, connect me with her? And I connected every guy to her, and she talks to everyone after I talk to them. And so, she kind of became the platoon mom. That's a funny thing because as toward the end of the book, someone asked me, like, you sound like they're your platoon. And when I was describing them, and I said, well, in a way they are, including the platoon leader, because they were abandoned and, they've never been talked to. They've never been allowed to tell their story in an open, forthright way. No one's ever told them all these dots that were happening around them. And just those pictures that I referenced earlier, when you understand those guys really couldn't see anything on the spur, it changes your whole view. But for 20 years, guys have been just flailing in their minds trying to make ends meet without being able to do it. And along the way, just feeling guilt and frustration about what happened. So, you mentioned the casualties earlier. I always add the platoon casualties after that, which they're still taking today. They're not all out of the woods. I talk to as many as I can continuously, but they're still taking casualties from it today.
So what I would like to do is let's dive into the command structure climate leading up to the firefight, if we can. There's a lot to unpack there. But I will say, as someone who was not in the military special ops side, obviously I spent time at the agency, but a very different, the agency is a very different place. It was almost unfathomable to me to think that this happened within the Ranger Regiment, that this type of leadership takes place there. Clearly, once you're in a place, you realize you can have bad leaders anywhere, you can have bad systems in place. But when you're on the outside, you just think, this is the special ops community. They're only pulling the best in. Yeah. So obviously, we talked about Pat. The book is about Pat, but it's also about toxic leadership, right? So with that context in mind, can you kind of set the tone for us as to how they found themselves, this unit found themselves with this toxic leadership structure and what that looked like for people?
Yeah. So again, great perspective to gain on the book itself and what really happened. One of the things, the one reason the first chapter of the book is about my experience as a lieutenant, and as I mentioned, in the greatest command climate ever, is because I wanted to show, first off, this is the standard I know of, Ranger leadership. And it was a shining standard that I, held in front of me my entire career. And I mean that. I never, other to where I was commanding, and even then, I don't believe I ever achieved that same level of harmony and just, common sense operational capacity. But I always tried. And so even after I left, I remember, I remember hearing from guys, they had a couple of toxic leaders come in and everything changed. And I talk about that in the chapter on toxicity, that, one thing we have to understand about especially our non-commissioned officers, is they live through this. The ones who go 20 plus years, they're living through this cycle. And, every 2 years, the commander changes and, and it's never, all good. These toxic leaders come in. It's, part of human nature. My discovery of that fact, you got to be in elite units to understand that. And it was while I was in the unit and working for a guy who, I used to scratch my head and go, how the hell did he get through the board for selection? And at the time I was working with the agency, so I was going back and forth all the time at the agency. And I had an incredible understanding of SAG and, ground branch at the time. And I couldn't believe some of the people I was talking to at the agency. I was like, how did this chowderhead ever get, how did they ever let him get in here? And how did he make it to this level, this high level? And what you take away from that is there's no 100% system for finding good people. There's elite units and organizations that have, time-tested processes that are pretty good, but they only work if the people implementing it are also common sense leaders, good leaders. If you get the wrong people implementing it, we all pick people who are like us. So toxic leaders pick more toxic leaders, bad leaders pick more bad leaders. So no matter where you go, you're always going to see that. I think the elite units have a higher, bottom common denominator. So the lowest common denominator is higher in special ops units than normal units, but the rest, you can have a just as good or better leadership team in a regular unit as you can in a special ops unit. And
some of the toxicity, Pete, is right. I mean, it's that extreme micromanagement, as you lay it out in the book very nicely, like extreme micromanagement, no trust in subordinates.
Yep.
And this idea that toxic leadership creates more toxicity in the environment. It spreads almost like a virus, is kind of how it's described.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's more important to understand toxic leadership climates than even just toxic leaders, because the problem is the climate. Once the climate goes toxic, and if you just think of real world, nobody lives in a place where acid rain falls. You can't plant anything. You can't go out outside your house. It's not a good place to live. Everybody goes to live where the climate is the best. And, that's why people flock to Southern California, and people flock to Florida. And the most expensive real estate in New York is around Central Park. People want to go into nice areas, and for climates, they want to live under healthy climates where they can grow and progress as human beings. And when they find one, they put down roots and they work as hard as they can to make it even better and to stay with it. And, just think of a neighborhood that way. Same thing. So, when the climate goes bad, and it can be it's usually more than one person that lead to a toxic climate, the whole system falls apart. And, there's no common denominator amongst toxic leaders. There's not, a bodily feature or a preference, philosophical or psychological preference. There's not. It's the negative side of human nature, and you described it very well. Selfishness, all about yourself, no moral compass. You're morally flexible. You just don't like other people. You take attitudes about other people. And as a leader, you never, ever think of your job as to take care of your people. You think of your job as they're lucky to have me, and now they're going to do everything I tell them, or they're not going to be here anymore. So the only way to diagnose a toxic leader is by the choices they make and the actions they take. And usually those choices and actions cause irreversible harm, not just to the people, but to the organization. And that's why, this was a textbook example of a toxic leadership climate, because it was more than just one person here. And, the final thing I'll say about toxicity is, you can stop it. We can stop toxicity, but someone's got to raise their hand, and someone who's close to that individual has to stand their ground. And, in this story, it really made me realize how important sergeant majors are, because a sergeant major should be the first check and balance against a crazed commander or a toxic commander. And, every sergeant major should know that your duty is to stand up or get between and stand your ground if that leader is making decisions that are causing harm to your people. So that's kind of the background on toxicity. And, we can talk more about it as we go through the story.
Yeah. Could you set the stage for where the Rangers are kind of sent in to, kind of in coast, give people the context of where their headquarters elements are, and start talking about the layers there, because I think that is so impactful to what happens later.
Yeah. So, by 2004, we were full up, going headquarters crazy, planning crazy. An important point to remember about that time frame is most every leader went to bed at night, put their head on their pillow, and instead of dreaming about, whatever your favorite dream is, everybody dreamt about being the one to, capture bin Laden. And so especially command elements who weren't real seasoned and hadn't been through this, for years like we had. It just never, we knew how hard it would be, how hard it is to find one person. So I just never even had that thought. To me, it was going to be a long game, but it was about doing things that made sense, not losing the hearts and mind. You can never win hearts and minds. That's a fable that needs to be corrected, but you can lose them. And in Afghanistan, our whole purpose right from the beginning was don't lose the hearts and minds, which incrementally we did. But the Rangers got a mission at the time and they jumped on it. And the mission was part of a larger operation that was going on in an attempt to close the border with Pakistan off as an open space for terrorists to come and go. So the operation, it was called Operation Mountain Storm, was designed to somehow create presence around the border, ensure that Al-Qaeda and Taliban forces weren't using the border villages as safe havens, and try to just smoke them out by going in and going through houses, thinking, I believe the thought was in one of these houses we're going to lift up, a trap door and there's going to be Bin Laden. And so they sent them over to Afghanistan, Khoust, which is right on the Pakistani border. It's eastern Afghanistan, farthest east in Afghanistan you can go. And the mission was to go out and clear this area of insurgents, which, right off the bat, as I'm hearing it, I was like, what does that mean? And the way they were going to do it is they were going to take these airborne Rangers, put them in vehicles to make them motorized Rangers, and then they drive around. And when you say this out loud, you understand the senselessness of it. Drive around as platoons into villages, clear the village, make sure there's no weapons caches and no enemy hiding inside any house in the village, then leave and go to the next village.
And Pete, if I can, I'm going to ask you to describe the terrain. And I would just tell people, because I checked this out, it was in the book. If you go to firefight.commonsenseway.com, you can follow along with what Pete's about to describe. And you can look at the terrain and understand the scheme of maneuver. So any military or history buff, you're going to want to go to that. And we'll have it in the description as well, so you can check it out. But I should say, for people who have listened, Coast is where I was based when I was in Afghanistan with our Apaches. We were at Selarino. I must have flown over Spera district 1 million times. I had no idea this is where Tillman died. And I hate that I didn't know that at the time. But we would launch out of Coast into 6 other provinces in that area because we were the only attack ships that could get out, basically. Wow. So, I mean, this is so close to home for me. But yeah, check out that website so you can follow along. And Pete, if you can describe the terrain there, it's not normal.
Yeah, no, thanks for bringing that up. And it's one of my favorite things to do. To write this book, I probably spent, and I'm not exaggerating, a couple hundred hours on Google Earth, just toggling, going back and forth, zooming in and out, looking behind little draws and spurs, and just really understanding that terrain. But the terrain jumped out at me as soon as I immersed myself in the investigations. This is the most daunting and difficult terrain maybe in the world. For sure, it's right up there in Afghanistan. Cross-compartmented. There's not a lot of people out there. There's foliage. So, in a lot of places, the mountains are barren in Afghanistan. They're not here. There's copses of trees. It's very alpine, and there's lots of what we kind of call scrub oak. Their version of scrub oak growing throughout the hills. So there's camouflage in the hills, but the terrain is just, incredibly difficult. Just driving through in any vehicle is not recommended. We would cut through that same area 2 years earlier after Afghanistan when I was in AFO. And we only had one rule: never go through that area as a convoy. And we followed it religiously. We would only go through in one beat up SUV at a time. We might have a drone flying above or behind doing reconnaissance, but we never got in a convoy, because you get in a convoy in that area. The other thing about that area is those Pashtun tribes are known to be like the toughest, most unruly two tribes, again, in Afghanistan. And, they make their living off smuggling and being bandits. So, they're used to hiding and running, and their favorite sport is, vehicular ambushes. So again, the terrain is a massive factor. And when you understand that, we will be shocked at the decisions that were made along the way to make them keep dragging that Humvee in that terrain. It's not drag it across Kansas, it's drag it across the Rocky Mountains. And so it makes the order even more unconscionable. So if you want to go back to Kaust, to describe what the lay of the land was, it was the Rangers with their own headquarters. And at the time, there was this new space age concept called the CFT, the cross-functional team, which, as many of the senior NCOs told me, should be historically noted as one of the reasons that we gradually began losing Afghanistan. And I try to convey that in the book. That's why I go into that depth on the chain of command, because they're in these space age shelters, with every high-speed electronic, accoutrement you can think of, giant 56-inch screens all over the place. Everyone's got a laptop. CNN or any other stations always on, so you can watch what's going on in the world. The air conditioners are humming. Starbucks is sending free coffee over. So, and the gyms, by 2004, there was a Gold's Gym at every post. So, you could get shredded while you were working and eat well, sleep well, and everything else. However, the guys you're supposed to be focusing on are not living that way. And, this platoon had been out in the bush for 8 days, which is really an exception to the way Afghanistan was fought. They slept around their vehicles at nighttime, but they were out for 8 days. And by the day that, Pat Tillman was killed in this firefight we're going to talk about, they were low on food, low on water, low on sleep, probably grumpy. Their clothes were starting to fall off. They were on the physical limits of their ability to operate.
Can I jump in real quick, Pete? So fact check me on this. Tillman's unit was in Iraq the year before. You coincide at the international airport in Baghdad. You happen to be there. You don't talk to each other, but you talk to NCOs from his unit. They go back to the States, and that was not a good climate there. It's the same leadership. They fly into Bagram early to mid-April. Bagram straight to coast. So it's like a day flight to coast, a couple hours. Then the very next day, they get in Humvees and drive on this mission where they're out for 8 days. So Tillman is 3 years in the military. He's been to Iraq for a short stint that wasn't awesome. And now he's 8 days into a completely new environment with the Rangers, right? So that's kind of where we're started. Their headquarters is I think it's at Selarino. Yeah. But then now start layering on the other layers of command, if you can, for people.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up. It's something everyone should know. I never would have stuck a platoon into combat that just arrived in country 2 days earlier, especially that area, especially because it's at altitude. Most of the time you're above 3,000 feet. The firefight happened, the ground where the firefight happened was 6,000 feet. So, it was 6,000 to 10,000 there. So you don't just stick guys, and thank you for using Pat, because you got to understand that about him and the guys around him. They're brand new. And so as I'm talking about the friendly firefight about to happen, that's why I make the point. New guys have no basis of knowledge of how, probable friendly fire is and how likely it is and how dangerous it is and how common it is. So that's not in their heads. The parts about not losing hearts and minds is not really in their heads yet, because they haven't connected with the Afghan people in any way until they kicked the first door down of the first house they went into. So that part is very important to remember. But yeah, you were asking me about the year before.
I was asking about, or sorry, I was just referencing the year before to show that like Tillman didn't have a great experience in Iraq, and it was short-lived, and now he finds himself in Afghanistan. But then I wanted to talk about the headquarters layering. Like you mentioned the talk basically, and the U-shaped desk. You got the big screens up, everybody's in there, but there's multiple levels of these that go up the chain.
So there's that one, which is, a space age talk sitting in Kaust, but it reports to the mothership space age talk, CFT, cross-functional team at Bagram. And this thing's massive, probably 200 people to staff it, keep it running all the time. Same thing, Bagram now already by 2004 is this sprawling, new town with Burger King and, all these little fast food joints.
Salsa night.
And a Gold's Gym equivalent gym, which guys need, but you can tell what's happening. And this CFT was doing the same thing that the other CFT is doing to the platoon. They're micromanaging them. They're whipping them on these color-coded, called sync matrices that drive everything they do. If you're yellow on a sync matrix, the commander in that CFT walks in and goes, well, what are they doing yellow up there? And that's what was going on with this platoon. They were yellow, then they were red. And, even in the CFT, one of the staff officers was saying, yeah, their vehicle's broken. They're working through it. Well, I don't give a crap. Tell them to get moving. They're falling behind the schedule. And so, that's the dynamic tension being driven from both of these. Now, the giant starship in Bagram reports to an even bigger starship in Balad, Iraq. That's where the special operations headquarters is. And they're monitoring everything going on in the CFT in Bagram and the stuff going on in Salerno. So the feeds are the same, even though you now have these three levels of hierarchy. And Balad is in charge, except when the general is back at Bragg, which is more time than not. Then the massive TOC back at Fort Bragg is in charge of the Balad TOC, that's in charge of the Bagram TOC, that's in charge of the Salerno TOC, that's micromanaging these guys on the ground. And they're all doing the same thing. They're all just living through their shifts. And they, the culture that goes along with the CFT is, we're here to tell you what to do. And, if you put me in charge of those CFTs, I tell them, turn your staff around. Your staff doesn't work for you. He works for these guys out in the field. And, the unit teaches you this from your very first day. When there's one man deployed, the entire unit back at Fort Bragg is working for that man. So, and this is how they describe it. So if you get a call at 2 a.m. to come in because that guy needs, a brown shoelace that it's buried in his kit, you come in. And, when they tell you, you're like, well, of course. And then, when you get to be that singleton, you understand the whole unit is behind you. And so, when you juxtapose that, and I'm glad you brought up Iraq, because these guys already know that what their command is like. The culture is already pervasive. It's not surprising to them that day. And one of the problems with toxicity over time, and you can kind of see this on a grander scale in the country with some of the things going on, you begin to not trust your senses. So when something doesn't make sense, you're so used to going, yeah, well, what does that matter? Who cares if it makes sense? Then nothing makes sense. And that's what manipulators are trying to do. They're trying to get you to surrender your common sense and just go, it's no use anyway, just do it, even if it doesn't make sense. And that's a real psychological process, but you see it happening here as the day unfolds. You see as these more and more outrageous orders come in, you're going, guys, protest, just say, hey, fuck it, we're not going to do it.
Yeah.
We're going to tell them we'll do it and we won't do it. But they don't do that. And a big part of it is, no one had died. And so until someone dies, no one really believes someone can die from it. And so they're just going, oh, well, you wouldn't believe what they told us now. And so as you hear them not allow them to leave the broken Humvee at border control point 5 first, then Magara second, you realize what's happened to them. They've been beaten down, not just for 8 days, but for, months and months, at least 12 months at the time. And so it gets harder and harder. And some of the individuals in that company who had, clashed with the chain of command were gone. They were fired because they tried to stand up for the guys.
Just a quick thanks to our sponsor, HelloFresh, and we'll get right back to this combat story. Oh, how I love HelloFresh. We've used this for over 3 years to prepare delicious meals for our family of 5, at least 3 to 4 nights every week. I was an avid user years before they sponsored us. One thing I love about HelloFresh is that it saves time and I don't have to go to the grocery store as often. I just do not enjoy going to the store and buying tons of ingredients that I end up not really using. I much prefer having a box delivered with literally every single thing I need to cook the meal, from the veggies to the meat to the seasoning, along with the cooking and preparation instructions. It makes making dinner fun and not a chore. I can do it with my family or on my own. It's easy either way. Our family has not had a single HelloFresh meal that we would not have again, and we have so many favorites, including one-pan pork fajita lettuce wraps, bulgogi meatballs, sun-dried tomato spaghetti, and more. You can order your meal for 2 or 4 people. We tend to order a meal for 4, and it feeds our family of 5, which includes 3 growing boys. When life gets busy, don't call for delivery, get HelloFresh. It's 25% cheaper than takeout and less expensive than grocery shopping too. Just choose your recipes and get fresh, pre-portioned ingredients so you can get cooking quick. So go to HelloFresh.com/50combatstory and use code 50combatstory for 50% off plus free shipping. That's HelloFresh.com/50combatstory and code 50combatstory for 50% off plus free shipping. And now back to this combat story.
And I think it's worth noting, you referenced the broken down Humvee. So Tillman's in a platoon. So technically the senior ranking person in this element is a platoon leader, right? So it's a first lieutenant who's a ranger. So he's probably been in the military 2 to 3 years, and he's leading these guys in unfamiliar terrain. They've got Humvees. One of them breaks down at this BCP number 5, which is like a border control. It's right on the border, Afghan, Pakistan. And they request to have it airlifted out. They're told no. They get some new parts in. They get it moving, breaks down. I think what is crazy, and people who have not been in the military won't understand this, and I do have a question for you, Pete, based on how you described your first year or two in Afghanistan, how much autonomy you had, and I wonder how much it is related to the technology available. So this platoon leader has a broken down vehicle. They are spending 5 hours at one point right outside of a village, an Afghan village, in completely unknown terrain. And to communicate with headquarters, he's got a satellite radio. He's got line of sight radio, which is no good because of the mountainous terrain. And he's got this email system, basically. So some of the stuff that you have in the book are literally the messages this guy is typing back to his XO, who's another lieutenant or junior captain, who's sitting next to a company commander, who's sitting next to a battalion S3, and then they're reporting up to a similar chain of command. So when he wants to get airlifted out, this has to go through several people to just get relayed back, no, do something else. So you've got the game of telephone going on, unresponsiveness, and this is a guy who's in the middle of nowhere with 20 plus guys on the ground with him, relying on him.
Yeah.
Like that's where we find ourselves. But there's so much technology that it's almost like you can rely on it. Whereas I assume when you're going into Afghanistan, you've got very little at that time. You're on your own.
Right. And that's very true. And the technology has, again, writing this and thinking about it as I'm writing it, that it made me realize probably in the first time that in my life and in modern warfare history for America, I believe we've gone backwards.
Agree.
And that's what technology has done. So if you think about everything that happened here and now try to take this and transplant it back in time to Vietnam, if this was Vietnam, the company commander and his RTO would have been sitting on a nearby hilltop with a half rhombic antenna. I can't believe I even remember what those were. It's a giant wire that, you used to have to put out, but it allowed you to talk, some crazy amount of kilometers. And he'd be sitting there with his PRC-77 radio, nodding off, but he'd be up all night, all day. They'd have a little perimeter. And until those guys came back in, that company commander would be on that hilltop relaying information for them. And so what's happened with satellite communication, and you didn't mention Blue Force trackers. So they've got beacons on their vehicles, which are incredibly valuable for understanding where your guys are. And we had those in Afghanistan and Iraq in the initial phases, and they were just hugely beneficial because you could see where they're at. And understand the terrain they're at and understand what they need and be like anticipatory for what they might need. And, I commanded in both those in the invasions. And, my only purpose was to figure out, be proactive. A firefight starts. Hey, Jimmy, give the helicopters a call, the gunships, tell them, we got a situation, don't need them now, but we might need them. And he's like, Roger, same thing, find out where the AC-130 is, find out if there's a armed predator anywhere nearby. That's just on, a guy getting on the radio going, I think we got a possible enemy formation up ahead. You have to be doing that. And that's part, again, that unwritten contract leaders have with their guys. When your guys are in the field, everybody who's not is got one purpose: to support the guys in the field. And that's whatever it takes to support them. And you set this up very well. He's a lieutenant, and he's a very good lieutenant. And I purposely,
he seems like it,
did not get involved with like him early or anything, because I didn't want to, become emotionally attached or have feelings. But everyone I talked to said he was a very good lieutenant. And, just that alone, when guys are talking with, no strings attached, totally, it's not attributional, but there's nothing to hold them back from being as honest as they want. And not a negative word was mentioned about him, but he needs help. He's still a lieutenant. And so he's going through this amazingly complex, decision-making process, and no one's talking to him. So, the email is one thing. It should be outlawed, unless you're hiding, and you can't talk. Email should never be used in a combat zone. They're emailing him, and they put him on the email to keep the other line open for something important. That was the comment. And they're the only ones out there that we thought. It turns out there's another platoon out there. But, that's why that command element. So as we tell the story, they're just cycling through VTCs, the Bragg to Balad to Bagram to
VTC being a telecom, like a video call with
video teleconference,
leadership.
Sometimes 3 hours long. Usually the highest ranking guy sits there and pontificates. When I was in Afghanistan twice, I got called in for a video teleconference from where we were out in the field in Gardez. And both times I came in, the guy talking to me was a staff general in Tampa. And both times he was in his Sunday golf outfit. And he thought that was real funny. Like, you know what? I came in, I cut my game short to make this. And I'm like, And it reminded me of that scene in Private Ryan where, he comes in to get the mission and the guys are eating a ham sandwich and shaving with hot water. And, he's just went through this incredible dilemma. And so that's, it's important, and it's not, when you're reading it, it's a little painful and you shake your head, but it's in there because, these senior NCOs shine the light on it for me. And remember, I've been in every one of these jocks before. I've been in every one of those locations, sitting in every one of them. And they were the ones who crystallized it for me that this process is as much to blame for our failures and lack of success in Afghanistan and Iraq as anything else. And if we're really going to genuinely learn from both those wars and learn in a way that we can adapt and protect future warriors like Pat Tillman and that platoon leader, then we've got to take in this lesson, and we've got to all understand we can never tolerate that type of command and control system to exist again for guys in combat.
It's worth noting, one of the things for me that really struck me was, at least when I was in Afghanistan, must have been 2008, our satellite radios on the aircraft weren't great. We were just really getting them installed. We had HF, but we're so far away, we cannot talk to our TOC anymore. Really, once we're about 20 miles off of the base, we're done. And so it's truly like commander's intent. What were you told before? Yeah. Make the best decision you can. And as a company commander, I'd go to sleep at night and I just have to trust that the guys are going to execute the way that we had talked about. And in the morning, I find out what happened. Here, I feel so bad for this lieutenant because everything is being micromanaged. Every decision, as a Ranger, this is what kills me. He's running every decision up the chain. So he's got the broke down Humvee. Basically, he's told, split your unit in two, get the Humvee close to this road where we're going to bring a wrecker in to get it. And I say this very loosely because it is no easy task what they're being asked to do given the terrain. And the other is go and do almost like a clearing operation in a town at night that you've never been at. Right. So he's told to split up and do that. He disagrees entirely. So as we lead into this, Pete, I would ask, I was floored to see that there's a sergeant major that just happened to be traveling with the unit that day. I mean, I think it's awesome that he was going around and going to see every platoon. This is the first one he goes to, and all of this is happening. I'm asking myself, why isn't he overruling some of these decisions from the field? Did that ever come up?
Yeah. So I didn't even know he was out there until I read the investigative documents, and it turns out I know him very well. He's one of the most, probably if you were going to talk about, the greatest warriors, most combat experience, he would be the one. He left the unit to go be the regimental sergeant major of the Ranger Regiment a month before that. And he started, like me, in 275A Company, which is this company. And so he, his thing when he took over was, I want to ride with every platoon in combat. So think about that. He what leaders still do that? And this happened to be the first platoon he was going to do a ride along with. So, the first point in this, as you brought up, is border control point 5. So they're on the border. This is the night before and the morning of the firefight. And it's at that point where the Humvee breaks down. The lieutenant gets on the radio to his company commander and the TOC and explains the Humvee's broken down. Recommend you send I think it's called a depot level mechanic, the high level mechanics, because our mechanic, it's beyond him. He can't fix it. And that was true. And if you can't do that, we'll just leave it here and airlift it out. This is just a postage stamp, and helicopters come in and out of there all the time. They pick stuff up all the time, but it's guarded. The Humvee, it was a no-brainer. And so, but that whole conversation is going on between the TOC and the lieutenant. So the lieutenant, out of respect, he doesn't know the regimental sergeant major. He's never really talked to him. And to a lieutenant, a high-ranking sergeant major is also can be intimidating. This guy, he's not intimidating. He was cleaning weapons with the guys, pulling security with them. But he never heard any of that. And so I flipped it around. To me, my question started becoming, why didn't these staff officers ever say, put the sergeant major on? Let me talk to him.
I agree. Yeah.
But they never did. And so he didn't even know the BCP-5 thing happened. He just suddenly heard the lieutenant say, hey, we're towing it with us. And, this is a good lieutenant. He was, very loyal. He was the West Point captain, number 1 in his class at West Point. And so he's very much he's not showing any emotions. He's not, this is what we're doing.
Not complaining.
Yeah. And which is very professional. But he also, there's no communication going on with the logic of why we're doing it. And everyone's just like, what? You kidding me? And so they, like good Rangers, they just rig it up. They don't know what's ahead of them. They're not understand. They don't know. They know the roads, but they don't know the exact road they're going to be on. They don't know they're going this route to Mana because it's a new route that the Afghans are recommending they take that might give them a chance of dragging this Humvee. So he doesn't know then. They go at 1.5 miles an hour. It takes them 4 hours to get to Magaro, where the wheels literally fall off the vehicle. So everything snaps. That vehicle can't be steered. It's got no front wheels. It's laying on the ground. You can no longer tow it, with straps. It has to be lifted up. The front end needs to be lifted so the back ends can roll. And so it was obvious what needed to happen there. You either got to get a wrecker in here, come airlift it out, or we need to blow it up. And again, he's on the radio for 5.5 hours. He's not, he's not grabbing the sergeant major or going, hey, you want to listen in? And no one's calling the sergeant major from the TOC. And again, my question is, I'm going through, Lieutenant does a great job in verbally sparring with, the rear. In fact, when they told him to split the platoon, he did a textbook job. He gave the 3 reasons why that didn't make sense. That's the logic of why. And he provided a textbook example to all future leaders of how you should be able to win the day. But even that, it was at that point I was like, why would you not call the sergeant major and go, hey, what do you think about this? And
the guy's been at the unit for years.
Exactly. Yeah. And he was like, we got to get moving. And in the end, in the investigation, he said it was wrong, but I didn't know what they were doing. And so not only did they not call him, but he just didn't know. And by the time they moved out, he wanted to get out of there too. So his spider senses were, on red alert as they were coming out of there. But again, he was caught in that dilemma of, one, you don't want to get in a platoon's way that's in the field or any organization. You want them to figure things out on their own and work their own system of decision-making, problem solving. He's very much like that, this guy. And so he didn't, there's nothing he could do. Yeah. And I will tell you that, that guy has paid the price. Afterwards, the investigators took it up. One of their theories was he was partially behind this, that this was a conspiracy. And so he was grilled by CID 7 times. He never got to see the investigation either. So when I found him and when I talked to him, I knew he had PTSD, like I was told that. And I talked to him actually once before that. He never mentioned how he got it. But as I'm talking to him now, investigating this, I'm like, Greg, what happened? Why did it have this effect on you? And the effect was because just what you said, it was guilt and frustration. Guilt, I should have done something. And the way I explained it to him was, when you or someone in your family or your friends, you're talking to them and they go and drive away and get in a car accident, it can even a fender bender or whatever, serious accident. you instinctively go through your mind, well, if I only hadn't talked, had to say that one extra thing, or if I hadn't gone back in the house to check on, the dog, he still wouldn't have been there. He would have left earlier and this wouldn't have happened. You start trying to rationalize it. And so that's what started with him immediately, but he's also being interrogated by CID, basically implying you're part of this. You knew what was happening. This is on you too. And he's a good guy, and all good guys will blame themselves.
For sure.
So he's blaming himself without understanding what's happening. And so when he told me all this, I said, okay, tell me why you feel guilty. He goes, I should have done something. I go, okay, let's talk specific. When should you have done something? Well, the first time when the mortar rounds went off, we all stopped. The shooting started. I should have gone to the front of the column at that point. I said, Greg, when that shooting started, you were 500 to 750 meters behind the Jenga truck and the lead Humvee. You couldn't have made it there if you sprinted, because they would have started moving again, and everyone was shooting, many of them on automatic machine gun fire. So weaving your way through an alley that has this much room on each side of the Humvee is going to be almost impossible. And they said, yeah, I still could have done something. I said, so like what? So at the end of this slot canyon, when they come out, that's where the spur is. As soon as you break out, there's the spur where you lay eyes on it. And he said, well, if I had been in that front vehicle, I could have stopped it. I said, really? Okay, that front vehicle, do you know that it was packed to the rim with people? No, I didn't know that. Yeah, there was no room. So let's say you threw the squad leader out of his front seat, which you'd never do, knowing him. Yeah. But let's say you threw him out. When you come around that corner, you can't see, there's just an Afghan shooting at you. And you've been shooting in that direction the whole time. You're going to shoot back. And I'm telling you what I would do, seeing the videotape of the reenactment, I would have probably shot too. And he said, well, maybe I would have been on a gun. I said, yeah, you would have been on a gun. The guns were shooting to be a machine gunner. You shoot where your squad leader shoots. And he shot at that Afghan. And unfortunately, Pat Tillman and now Sergeant Major O'Neill were right behind him. And so the cone of fire from those machine guns instantly put those guys under fire, and with hundreds of bullets. And it was him who, after that, a few hours after that, called me back, and he was like, hey, thanks for turning the Surefire on. This is the first time I've been able to see some light at the end of the tunnel. I
That's
really,
great.
I owe you. And I said, you don't owe me a thing. Military owes you. You've been 20 years in prison for nothing. And you should have been shown the investigative documents a long time ago. Someone should have walked you through this and told you there was nothing you could do. And if there was, why didn't they ever call you? And I'll tell you why, from thinking about it. They didn't call you because they didn't want to hear. They knew what you'd say. You'd say, blow that vehicle. Do not tow that vehicle anymore. They didn't want to hear that. And by not calling you just proves they had no interest in what you were thinking. And so that's what I meant. Each guy I talked to, it was this, this amazing experience, because they've been in a cave for 19 years, torturing themselves. And knowledge is the best medicine when you're trying to overcome, psychological pain and frustration.
It's so true. So for those who haven't been through like that PTSD training that you can get, not training, but treatment, kind of what you just did there seems a lot like cognitive behavioral therapy, where like you challenge these assumptions that you've had, and they really force you to think of like, what could you have done? Like what else is out there? Because there's a lot of regret that goes along with it. It's almost like you walked them through that, which is pretty amazing. So you mentioned you have two units on different sides. So we've got one unit that leaves this one area with the Jenga truck, so kind of a local Afghan truck pulling this broken down Humvee, and half of the unit, and then half are going a separate route, right? So can you give us the idea of like, how do they end up converging into that area with the enemy?
Yeah, and so it might also be good. I know you gave the hyperlink, but like maps, those simple maps might be good too to throw up while I'm talking, because I'll just take you back. I'll start in Maghera. So where I said the wheels came off, that's Magara. And Magara is only, it's a short distance still to where this firefight happened, but they can't move. And they call back and request, either a wrecker, an airlift, or to blow the vehicle. So the first thing they look at is they come back, we can't get a helicopter. It'll take 2 to 3 days to get a helicopter. That's the first thing. Now, it turns out in interviewing a guy who was in the TOC, there was a helicopter sitting right outside the TOC. And it was dedicated to the battalion commander in case he needed to go back to Bagram and talk to the commander there if, something urgent popped up. So there was actually a helicopter there that could have been repurposed, but that thing was part of this same massive bureaucracy of headquarters that was overseeing this. So no helicopter. And then they tell them as far as blowing it, it's simple no. You can't destroy, government goods. You hear the post facto explanation from the battalion commander. He says there's a policy against that. And of course, I'm reading this after blowing up a tank, a $4.5 million tank 1 year earlier that I hadn't even thought of again until this. And he used that as an example. He said, these guys blew up a tank in Iraq and got in a whole bunch of trouble for it.
It was propaganda is what they were saying. Like the Iraqis were able to use it for negative, like kind of propaganda.
Yeah, which is ridiculous. But no, he just said we got in trouble for blowing up a vehicle and we didn't. No one ever even asked me about that because it was obvious. It was obviously the right thing to do. But so they tell him, we can't get the helicopter. You can't blow it up. That's against policy. There's no such policy. And it turns out that vehicle, we believe, is the one they found on Bagram when they arrived. The unit before them had abandoned it. So they added it to their, their supply roster. So it wasn't even on the books, but he's, pretending like this is some valuable thing. We can't blow it. And I might also add in there that, in the debacle of August of 21, we left $85 billion to include around 10,000 perfectly working Humvees behind. So, not blowing that one's even more outrageous in that context. So you can't do either of those. And they tell them, hey, we can get a wrecker, but that wrecker is not allowed off the KG highway. So you're, on a map, you're 15 kilometers away. You got to figure out a way to drag that Humvee 15 kilometers to link up with this wrecker.
And there's no road, like the roads aren't like we think of them as roads, right? I mean, there's
they're creek beds, they're dry creeks. Right. There are no roads. You're driving on dry creek beds. That's how they get around in the mountains of Afghanistan. So, these guys, again, this is what I referenced earlier, they've been beaten with so much senselessness that even this, it's frustrating that everyone's like, you got to be kidding me. And it's important to get inside guys' heads. We often don't do that historically. As an example, I believe if you could get inside the British redcoats' heads during the Revolutionary War, you'd hear them going, if we fucking line up in this cornfield again and let them start shooting at us from behind the rocks, I'm quitting. I'm leaving. I'm going to become an Indian. So I think that's what those guys were saying. And here, same things happen in Magra. They're going, this fucking unbelievable. These guys, they're out to lunch. They don't give a shit about us. And those were real words they were saying. They just don't give a shit about us. So that's creating anger and frustration. And again, as you see, one of the lessons of the book is, stress, emotional stress is one of the biggest killers on the battlefield. And every soldier needs to know how to negate that emotional stress, how to switch back to their cool, calm, collective thinking brain. And it's easy to do by just breathing and talking calmly, but most guys don't know that. So you've got this buildup in Magra, 5.5 hours they're sitting there with swarms of kids and Pashtun tribe members running around them, with a group of about 5 males sitting up in the hill, very shady looking guys talking, one or two of them coming and going all the time, you can draw easy conclusions from what was happening there. But they're stuck.
Sorry, Pete, can I interrupt? I'm so sorry to interrupt, but I think it's one thing that struck me is in that scenario where it's hours when they're sitting there surrounded with, not surrounded, but like with these people milling about, what Tillman is doing at that time, which is pretty cool. So leave it to you on that.
Yeah, no, great. And it says a lot about him. So, and about the other leaders, Tillman's, is monitoring his people. He's cool as a cucumber. He's going back and forth. You got enough water? You doing all right?
Yeah.
Eat some food. You don't want to, once you start starving, you don't focus. Pay attention to the enemy. And he's doing what, again, his part of the contract, being vigilant, being a good, positive, supportive leader to his guys, de-stressing them. Stress is contagious. So is cool, calm, and collectiveness. So, that's being passed to the guys around him. He's not flipping out. He's not, allowing his emotions to get the better of him. He's still being funny all the way through. But the platoon leader is, probably a absolute wreck, because inside him is this, conflict between taking care of his guys and doing what you're told to do, which has been pounded into his head. His whole previous 4 years as he learned how to be an officer. And so it's an incredible dilemma. Finally, they just give up, and the platoon leader is like, we got to do it. We've been ordered to get half the platoon to Mana before sundown. So the sun is already sitting right on the ridge line. It's dipping below the ridge line at this point because it's almost 1800 local time. And all he can do is split the platoon, like they said. They denied his split the platoon, alternative option. And all he can do is split them up the best he can. With the time ticking away, he can't put a lot of thought into it. They not only split the platoon, but they split it with specific, splits. Send me the 81 mortars, send me the snipers, send me this guy. And they were doing that to get those guys back to plan the next dry hole. There was no reason to get them back. And never, ever do you split organic team relationships in a combat zone if you don't have to. And this is what's happening. The first, step toward tragedy is happening right there. They're splitting the platoon apart. Serial 1 will be led by the lieutenant. Pat Tillman will be in that. They'll drive out first. They're not towing the vehicle. They should be able to make it quickly, get to Mana, and sit, because they already know there's nothing they can do at sundown. You're not allowed in a village till the next morning. So they literally tell them, get there by sundown so you can just sit and wait till the next morning. And that kind of shows you it was a check the box. They were trying to change the color on the sync matrix so they could report up to the battleship in Bagram, who could report to Balad, who could report back to North Carolina that we're green. And instead of caring about this platoon, and instead of just looking at a satellite photo of the terrain around them of Magara, even looking at the short 3.5 kilometers they have to go between Magara and Mana, if you looked at that, you go, whoa. No, we can't make them drag that vehicle. This is, literally like trying to drag a vehicle through the Grand Canyon. That's not hyperbolic.
Yeah,
that's
a good way to say it.
And so they tell them to do it. And the platoon, who's been beaten for months and, has just sucked it up all this time, it sucks it up again. And they hire a Jenga truck. The Jenga truck lifts the front end on chains of the Humvee. So it's not just a Jenga truck dragging a Humvee by chains. It's an unsteerable Humvee. So that thing, think about trying to get through rocks when the vehicle behind the wheels don't articulate. There's no turning. That's why it took so long to get through that canyon. So they take off from there. And as they take off, it's very ominous. The guys disappear. Someone passed a note to one of the random Rangers that said, hey, come talk to me. Something to the effect, there's there's enemy situation and it's very dangerous for you. And, in retrospect, who knows if it was real or what, but there's all this ominous danger already building up as they leave, and the sun's going down. So they pull out of Magara, the two serials. The first one goes left, at this Y intersection, and the second one, whose mission is to drag the Humvee back to the highway to meet with the record, goes right. And of course, they had taken the road to the right on their way in. And, a lot of them already knew it's impossible to go that route, but they were ordered to do it. And so they figured, we'll do it till we can't. Well, the Jenga truck driver, as soon as they turn right, slams on his brakes. He's like, no can do. I am not going that way. You can't go that way either. This is all through an interpreter. There's no way any vehicle can get this Humvee over the mountain on that trail. And it doesn't make sense because this turn to the left is shorter, faster, and much easier to drive on. And so
they didn't tell the Jenga driver what the route was out of operational security. So
right.
The fact that he stalls at that point is not because he was in on it. It was he didn't know what he was getting into. And when he got to a point of this doesn't make common sense, he was like, I'm out of this. I'm not going that way.
Yep. And so that turns him around. And now, remember I told you the platoon leader did this textbook example of why you can't do it. Number 2 was comms. There's no line of sight comms in here. We only have one SATCOM. As you said, SATCOMs work, but they don't always work. So, it's hard to depend on it and anything can go wrong. But that's the one lifeline they have is that SATCOM radio. And of course, as in this case, it didn't work either because the mountains around them are so close that even getting a satellite signal, remember, usually the go-to satellite is the one to the south, the Indian Ocean one. So you usually can get line of sight by just finding an opening southward wherever you're at in the world. But they're already in, canyon land. So they've already got anything from 500 to 1,500 foot walls up to both sides of them. And, nothing worked. He can't get comms at the Y intersection with serial 1. And so he tries to call back to headquarters, back to the, $1 million space age talk in Kaust. No answer. He tried 3 times. That's all you can do. No answer. So again, to anybody who knows, for a SATCOM radio, when I read that, I was like, that's almost impossible because that feed is on in every one of those talks I described to you. Everyone has all of the colored special operation unit headquarters satellite radios feeds on 24/7. So, that's green, blue, red, purple. All those SATCOMs of the special mission units are on all the time. So I was like, how could they not have answered a satellite radio call? And so that's what got me to start looking at the Balad talk and find out why they didn't hear it either. And I'll tell you about that in a minute. But they called the platoon sergeant tried on all the radios. He didn't get through. He had a partial transmission get through to serial 1, which was the platoon leader and one of his squad leaders, but it was broken. And basically they heard that he was turning around, but they didn't hear where he was going. So they didn't instantly, make the connection that they're right behind us. They're coming behind us. And remember, they're in a hurry. So for the platoon leader, now you're going back. Here's this platoon leader. He's in the front seat. So it's 2004. There were already IEDs had started in Afghanistan. We had been through Iraq, and they're going heavy in Iraq. But so you're watching, anytime you're in Afghanistan or Iraq, you're watching the road. The TC, the guy in the front, has to be looking for suspicious stuff. They've never been here before. So they're navigating by map. And so they're trying to figure out, and I consider myself a PhD map reader, but I know when you get spun into a new area full of mountains, you're trying to line it up. It takes time, heavy concentration time. So he couldn't make that connection. And, as I point out in the book, the other hugely negative part about stress is it turns off your thinking brain. And not only do you not come up with cool, calm, collective solutions, you don't recognize opportunities when they avail themselves in front of you that might allow you to avoid, the what's up ahead, the danger up ahead. So they just didn't pick up on it. They kept going. They had an order, get to there before sundown, and it was almost sundown. Right? This happens at 1845 or 1840 when the first shots are fired. So they hurry on to Mana, and without any clue where Serial 2 is or the fact that they're coming behind them. Serial 2, they have no other option. They got to press forward, keep trying on the comms to make communication, which the platoon sergeant did. And they come up to the canyon, and as soon as they pull in, this canyon, again, if you're not on the website looking at it right now, and I encourage everyone to get on that website, firefight.commonsenseway.com, because you cannot believe it until you see it. It's like riding, if the Colorado River was dry, it would be like following the Colorado River through the Grand Canyon. And even the creek bed they're on is full of massive geometric shaped boulders and scree and divots. And so you'll see times in the video reenactment, you're like, there's no way a truck could get through that hairpin turn right there, especially a truck towing a Humvee, which is chained to it and lifted up in the back. And all the guys in Serial 2 are behind that Humvee and that Jenga truck. So as they get in there, and the first thing that happens is they make contact. The 2 mortar rounds or RPG rounds land, and everyone is just all ears, all eyes. It takes a couple seconds, then automatic weapon fire opens up behind it, and then the Rangers open up. That's your SOP. When you're in an ambush, suppress the enemy and get out of the ambush. So they're doing the first part, and now you're all in your full fight or flight of when a firefight starts. You're in a massive rush, to do anything, and they're stuck. This Jenga truck's not moving. The guy's refusing to drive it. Initially, the guys, most of them jumped to the conclusion he was with the enemy, but he wasn't. He was just scared out of his wits, and he didn't want to keep driving under fire. But they get him back in and start going again, and he moves at less than 1.5 miles an hour. They believe he was moving at 1 mile an hour, trying to get through these little patches, and this firefight's ongoing. And that's why it was a 12-minute firefight in there. They're pounding away. The echoes are, just unsustainable. The noise is unsustainable. That's why they went temporary deafness, which sets in after 30 seconds of noise over 127 decibels. So that's them. They're stuck in the canyon behind this Jenga truck towing a Humvee. They're trying to get out of the canyon. They already were pissed off and frustrated going in. Now, this is the equivalent of claustrophobia, which is the biggest stress inducer to human nature that is. And that's because we don't have freedom to adapt. When you're stuck in a small space, extreme is buried alive in a box. That's why panic is trying to override your system, because you have no freedom, you have no options. And that's what these guys are going through in that canyon for 12 long minutes as they're stuck behind this thing. Remember, normally you're on the radio, get headquarters, get something. They've already, pretty much in their mind know they're not going to help us. We have no out by that. We just got to get out of this ourselves. So that takes you to the middle of the firefight.
I will say one of the things that really struck me with the way it's written, and testament to you as you put it together, is it's not written with any blame. I think the way we're talking about it right now assigns a lot of like, this is ridiculous that this happened, but it's written, and again, it says it's a case study, and it's very like black and white terms. So I feel like right now, as we're describing it in the moment, there's a little bit more, I don't know, context being dropped on it, but in the moment, it's just, this is what's going on. Here are the communications between people. Here's what we're hearing. So from that perspective, I really, I couldn't even believe you were able to detach yourself. The way you mentioned, like not wanting to get too attached to the platoon leader, like I was right there, like, man, I feel for this guy. But you kind of stay out of it, which I think is really nice the way that it's presented.
Thanks. And yeah, I think just as a writer, as an investigator, you have to do that. And again, as I mentioned to you up front, writing this was a journey to me. So I wrote it, the story as it's unfolding, and I didn't get into the nuts and bolts of the actual final moments where Pat Tillman dies until the end of my writing. And, when I did, that became like this finally good news part of this whole thing. I mean, even though he ends up, there doesn't change what happens, but you end up with this, incredibly motivating story of how he carried himself in his final minutes, and the guy next to him, how he carried himself as a brand new private, and then how he pulled himself up by his bootstraps and then went on to carry this legacy and pass on those incredibly valuable lessons that he learned, which, run the gamut of what we've already talked about. It wasn't until then that I began to understand the implications of what happened before it. So as I'm writing it, I purposely stay detached. And even now I add the emphasis when we talk about it, because you got to see it to believe it. And when you talk about it, put it into terms, you can't help but add some emotional commentary, because it's so unbelievable, not only what they're being told, but what they're going through at the time. And it's also important to know that, because then you better understand the devastation that this whole thing had on these guys.
And again, this is not to suggest that you were like over-indexing on it. That's just the way it was. And in the book, it's so detached. So you got Serial 2 in contact, mortars come in, they're returning fire, they're deaf. I didn't even understand the decibel thing until you mentioned it with the echoes. That's crazy.
Yeah.
And that's Kennedy's in the back of that Serial 2, right? Sergeant Major.
Yes, the Sergeant Major's back there. So it's not Kennedy. He's the ex-Sergeant Major. This is the guy from the unit.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Yeah.
But it's okay. He's in the back. And so simultaneously, let's go back to those first either mortar or RPG rounds land on the side when the firefight breaks out with Serial 2. Serial 1 had just arrived outside Mana. So they had accomplished their purpose. They got to Mana. They were a little lost. And as I said to you, you never know exactly where you're at until you do a real good map study. And usually, again, that's where it's so great to have people with you, a couple of squad leaders, and go, hey, I think we're here. And the squad leader will look at it and go, no, we're actually right here. They were a little off. And again, not like they were lost. The creep bed does a Z formation where they were, and it doesn't really show that on the map. The map they had was a 1 to 100,000, so you don't really see that. And they were just trying to pinpoint their location on the map when they heard boom, boom. So they're still Serial 1, Tillman, all the platoon leader, they're all sitting in their Humvees. And by the way, they also have the 7 Afghans with them who are in 3 Toyota Hiluxes. So they're all sitting just outside Mana. Boom, boom. Rounds go out. The guys jump out of the vehicle. The senior squad leader, who's now the second in charge, he was just like, what the fuck is that? And no one knew. But as the fuselage opens up after, and you could instantly see behind them the arcing tracer fire. Even at that time of day, you could see it very clearly. It was obvious that there was a firefight going on in the canyon behind him. And, again, this is where there's a lesson here for everybody if you haven't been through it. And was taught to me by my old Ranger Sergeant Major Leon Guerrero, which is don't be in a hurry to die. And, he saved me by teaching me that as a lieutenant, because, most warriors are aggressive by nature. And, aggressive is one step away from being impulsive. You're ready to go. You want to go to the sound of the guns. You want to get into it for good reasons, not for glory. You believe in your own capability and you want to get into those fights. And I was that guy. I was, someone who would just run off to the sound of the guns or anything else. And he took time. This is where, sergeant majors are so valuable in battalions and especially battalions. He took the time to teach us that. And teaching, he used, LZ X-ray in Vietnam as the example. And it's a perfect example because that's what happened there. As they were landing, a lieutenant saw a Viet Cong on the tree line, and the Viet Cong had this trick down pat at the time. The Viet Cong looked and took off running. And so that sets off an instinctive chase, behavior by all mammals. And off he runs without telling the rest of the platoon. They're trained to follow their platoon leader. So 27 guys ran into the jungle without telling anybody why they were doing it. And when they finally stopped to catch their breath, they were surrounded by a battalion. And LZ X-ray, we were soldiers once and young, was really an operation to rescue that wayward platoon leader. And that's what I meant. I was that platoon leader. I had 4 years in the Army of fighting pretend enemies and using blanks instead of bullets. So, I probably, screwed up 100 times in those 4 years, but I learned from every time I screwed up. And I learned from Sergeant Major Leon Guerrero to take a breath and think about what you're doing before you do it. And over time, he saved me and probably my men, whether it was running into an uncleared building, running off a darkened LZ or onto a helicopter on a darkened LZ, or just running to the side of the guns. I always checked myself, took a breath, talked about it, and then did it. But so that's a lesson out of this for these guys. What they were doing made total sense. That squad leader knew it had to be serial 2 back there because he could see the green tracers, and he just put it all together. You don't hear that type of machine gun fire from anything but another group of Americans. And so his instinct was, we got to help them. You guys stay here. The rest of you follow me. We're going to run up to the high ground so we can see what's happening and provide fire support. And so we can finally get comms to talk to them and see if we can maneuver and help them in another way. So off they all run up this spur. And this is in the opening minutes. It took them we believe about 4 to 5 minutes to get up there. Pat Tillman, I mentioned the squad leader said, you guys stay here, the rest of you follow me. Tillman grabbed his guy, who is, the private at the time, and said, hey, let's go help our boys out and let's go kill some bad guys. And, when they ran up there, it was an unbelievable smoker. But Tillman is like bounding up, 7 feet at a time. And he's like passing people. And you'll see a videotape on there, too, of the route they followed up. They got to the top and, it's a maze. You don't really know where you're at once you're up there, but they just ran till the trail kind of flattened out. And that's where he realized, I can't see the canyon from here, because the canyon, all he could see was the hills above the canyon. He's now probably 150 feet above where they're parked, and it's too high to see into the canyon. So he goes to plan B, let's make comms, and he just starts trying to make comms, but he can't make comms either. And so, the two reasons they went up there, he realized did not make sense. And that's what I point out too. This guy is an incredible squad leader. He's an incredible warrior. Anyone would want him on the team. Even while he was up there, incredible wisdom, kept his guys cool, calm, and collective. But, none of us without lots of experience understand the fickle nature of decision-making in combat. What makes total sense right now may not make any sense 5 minutes from now. And you got to be tuned into that. You got to tune your senses that as soon as the assumptions you made, and remember, they assumed that it wasn't a fact. They assumed that by going to the high ground, they could provide fire support to the other half of the platoon and talk to them on the radio. As soon as you disprove your assumptions, you've got the whole basis upon which your actions stand have just collapsed. So it makes no sense to stay up on that high ground. That's like a PhD thing. And, events happen so we can learn from them. And that's an event that I think will save a lot of people's lives in the future, because it'll cause leaders to be more tuned into that. And I had the advantage of being in the unit where you realize that you're given the freedom to change your mind, to adapt to the situation going on around you. And freedom of choice is the freedom to change your mind. And when you don't do that, you always end up regretting it. And when you do it, it always seems to work out for the better. So I had been through that enough. This was not a lot of time either. So remember, it took them 5 minutes to get up there. These guys are going to come out in about 6 more minutes. They're going to pop out. So they only had about, 6, maybe 7 minutes up there to kind of make that assessment. And so it probably took them 3 minutes just to kind of come to the conclusion, I still can't make comms. And that leaves 4 minutes left. But remember, the noise and the explosions are getting closer. So I'm saying that not to armchair quarterback them. I say that lesson is just a lesson that we learn with no blame or anything on the guys involved. But that's what happened up there. So they're up there waiting on the spur, hearing this firefight gets closer and closer. But now what's happening is the horseshoe nature of this canyon is causing Serial 2 to go on literally a 360 journey through that canyon. And the brain can only calibrate directions with either a compass or a known fixed point. And the way we tell directions is, again, through our thinking brain. There's grid cells in our brain that tell you when you're near that thing that you have a sense of direction for, whether it's the sun setting, a high mountain, the ocean in the distance. That's where your sense of direction comes. But when you spin people around and put them under stress, those matrix cells in your brain are not operating. So they're shooting and they don't really understand that, they're turning in this mushroom shape out, over, down, back in, and then down again. So they literally went, north, northwest, south, southeast, and then east, then finally west again. So they went all directions. And what's happening is the cone of fire and beaten zones from their machine guns are moving with the weapon system and with the Humvee as it's, going over these beach ball sized boulders. It's moving and the gun's moving like this too. And when a gun barrel wobbles, you can have a beaten zone that stretches for, 400 meters. That's just where machine gun bullets land. So think about that. A 400-meter beaten zone is a lot of potential to hit someone. The fact Serial 1 wasn't hit is pretty incredible. But you still have guys shooting at them. And enough guys saw these guys in both serials that it's obvious that they were up there. At some point toward the end, they disappeared. I asked each of the guys who visually saw them, did you see them in the end? No, the last time I saw them was about middle way through the canyon. So, you've got this incremental firefight going on. Serial 1 is stable, but they're up on the high ground away from their vehicles. And Serial 2 is in the ambush in the slot canyon, and they have no idea Serial 1 is even anywhere close to them. And you would not think they would be. But that's why I bring up this thing called location assumptions. They assume when they do see Serial 1, they're going to be in their vehicles, which is the last place they saw them, and they're going to be on the low ground, not the high where the enemy's been. So that brings us up to, the end of the firefight right before they come out of the slot canyon. And you can kind of see the table is set, for a tragedy or a catastrophe. And, at this point, there's not many things that could save them. As I point out, one thing that could have saved both, the guys up on the spur, Tillman and O'Neill, and the guys in the vehicle, was if they hadn't broken apart the organic team relationships. So Tillman and O'Neill's squad leader is riding in the front seat of the Jenga truck. So there's no
separate serial.
Yeah. So your squad leader at this point is like, your big brother, your dad, like they watch over you. They're taking all their experience that you don't have and anticipating what's going to happen next and taking action to, avoid or take advantage of what's going to happen next. But they didn't have that. And so no one, and it wasn't the squad leader up there's fault. He was never told these guys are part of your squad now. You're in charge of them. He had his own squad. And, I believe if Tillman's, squad leader was there, there's a high probability he would have said, guys, they're coming out of the canyon any minute now. Let's get back behind the military crest. We're on the front edge of this spur. We need to get back, on the military crest. But they didn't have that. And then the guys in the vehicle are mostly weapon squad members, which Kevin Tillman was part of the weapon squad too. And their squad leader is also in the front seat of the Jenga truck. So a weapon squad leader, anyone can control machine guns. All rifle squad leaders, that's part of their job. And most of the time, machine guns are attached to the rifle squads in classic infantry operations. This wasn't a classic infantry operation. This was a PhD infantry operation. And the things that machine gun teams do that takes them to the PhD level is about control. And it's about the ability to control fires with verbal commands, hand and arm signals, and backups to those two, to include pyrotechnics. And they rehearse that all the time. But a rifle squad leader doesn't know that. And so he didn't really know how to control those guys. There might have been times where he wanted them to not shoot as much, but he didn't have that. They never rehearsed like this. They never gone through the immediate action drills that you're supposed to do at that point. So in this final moment, where Serial 2 is coming out of the slot canyon and about to turn the corner where they will lay eyes for the first time on the spur where the rest of the platoon is, they have very few chances left of negating the catastrophe or changing the outcome.
And you mentioned, I can't believe I didn't call this out sooner, Kevin Tillman. So for those who don't know, Pat's brother is in the same unit, on the same op. So, and he's on the Mark 19, right? In this case, I believe. So and he had never fired it before.
Yeah, it's a great story on him. Thanks for bringing him up. First off, he was a really good soldier. Things come out when you're talking to guys. Patterns avail themselves over time when you hear it once, twice, three times. And I never asked anybody, hey, was Kevin or Pat a good soldier? That just came out, when I talked to these guys. And everybody said, yeah, Kevin was a really good soldier. A lot of guys had said, he's a guy that definitely, can either go on the sniper team or, someday go to the unit. Wow. He was just a really good soldier. and Pat was too. But Pat, they expected to be a leader, to go to OCS and whatever, and Kevin kind of too. But everybody honed in on, Kevin really had these great advanced soldier skills and a great way about him. And so it's very interesting in Magara, he's frustrated too. And in the investigations, he's one of the first guys to say we should have blown the vehicle, put C4 on that vehicle. So he's taking it differently in Magara himself. But remember when I told you right before they left, the platoon leader in the final minutes, that's when the split happened and they transloaded stuff from vehicle to vehicle. So he gets thrown out of his vehicle. He's going with serial 2. The first choice and what he hopped on first was the 50 cal in the lead vehicle, which, the first clue that this was friendly fire was from the 50 cal bullets that were pried out of the rock, the boulder that Pat Tillman was hiding behind. So Kevin gets up behind the 50 cal and he wanted to take that. He's familiar with the 50 cal. And, at that point, everyone's just kind of like, I got this one, you call in where you're going and what vehicle. So I probably would have grabbed that vehicle too. But the weapons squad leader, who's still their squad leader and is making the call, goes, no, you're not the senior guy. The senior weapons squad member always takes the 50. He got the 50. And Kevin, go take the Mark 19 on the rear vehicle of serial 2. So Kevin went back to that Mark 19. And that's where, through as soon as he got back there, he told one of the squad leaders, hey, I've never shot a Mark 19 off a vehicle before. And, I've actually never shot. I didn't even get to shoot the Mark 19, back in the rear. And, that ends up being positive for him because he couldn't fire that thing in the Slot Canyon. And if you think about that Mark 19, if that thing had been operational, if that had been arcing over the hill, like the 50 and the 7.62, the being fired and the saw rounds being fired, it would have been mass casualties on serial 1, but he couldn't get that thing to operate. So, he would have either been in the lead vehicle shooting at his brother's position, or if that vehicle, if the Mark 19 had been properly loaded and checked, he would have been showering serial 1 with, 40 Mike rounds. But he's in there too, and all his weapons break down because the machine gun on that vehicle had its buttstock sheared off by the walls of the canyon. That's how tight these walls were. It ripped the buttstock off. So he had nothing left. In the firefight, he's got his 9mm out and he's fired his 9mm, which he fired 8 rounds from. And, it's incredibly valuable to hear that because you realize, like, not only did they see and they're returning fire, but the desperation that they're in, stuck in that canyon behind that Jenga truck. And he went through all that. So, it's important to remember he's in this massive stress situation. And as we go through this to the, post firefight, you'll see it's even more unbelievable that they specifically did not tell him, as one of only 3 members of the platoon, not what happened. He's the guy who would have understood better than anyone, the tragic accident that happened that ended up killing his brother. Again, he's firing 9mm rounds out of that canyon. He knew he lived chaos. Like very few people live chaos and frustration. Remember, this gun doesn't work. This one's sheared off. All I got is a pistol. I'm going to die with a freaking pistol in my hand. And
the fact that Pat knows his brother is the one engaged in the other canyon.
Yeah. So he and on that, that's, people have asked that quite a few times, and that probably, he probably internalized that at some point, but I don't think, the description of him or whatnot, he he was a warrior, and this is what he trained for. And so when it happened, he said the two things that, any great warrior would say, the logical why he went, let's go help our boys and let's go kill some bad guys. He didn't say, let's go help Kevin.
Yeah.
He said, let's go help our boys and let's go kill some bad guys. And, again, trusting that, things would work out. But, Kevin's in the rear vehicle. He's stuck and he's in the same firefight as it progresses through the horseshoe/mushroom shaped canyon. And now we're about to come out, on the base of the spur.
So I think at this point, let's talk through how this ends for Pat. Obviously, you mentioned the 50 cal rounds in the rock, and then we're just scratching the surface. Like the book that you wrote details so much more than this. So like, I don't want anybody to come away with this like, oh, I've heard this. You have not heard this. This is just like some of the highlights here. But yeah, I want to take us through that. But I also, you've mentioned so many times, like how you can get out of those stressful environments. And I think I'd be remiss if I didn't ask, like, did you train for that at the unit? And that's maybe something we can do on the back end of this. Like, how can people train themselves on that if it's something at all that you can kind of train yourself for? Yeah,
no, I think I bring it up in the book for this situation right here, because the guys, specifically the guys in Serial 2 in the canyon, I mentioned it. They're already two emotions, frustration, pissed off. So those are two of the most negative emotions we have in our head. They shut down your thinking brain faster than anything. And then they get claustrophobic, and doesn't matter what your training is. When you're stuck in an elevator, you're going to feel claustrophobia. And when you're stuck in a slot canyon with the enemy shooting at you in a giant truck moving at 1 mile an hour in front of you, you're going to experience claustrophobia. So these guys were in a hell. And the way we, neutralize emotions is through our senses. Our neocortex is the only part of our brain that allows us to make sense. So your senses don't work while you're emotional. When you're spitting saliva, pissed off, afraid, whatever is causing it, you're not thinking. And your senses aren't operating, your vision, your hearing, but they lost their second most important human sense, their sense of hearing. So not only can they not talk to each other, but they know they're deaf. Like their ears are ringing. It's a maddening ring in your ear when you get temporary deafness. But what the real stress comes if you start allowing yourself to think about it. I can't hear what anyone's saying. I don't know what anyone's saying. I don't know if someone's behind me. It can even ramp you up to a higher level. So they had everything going against them there. And, what I learned in the unit and then, learned to learn the scientific logic of why it makes sense is how to control your emotions. And the unit taught us, and I remember the training, the unit psych taught it. It just taught you how to do basically meditation. And, meditation, was laughed at for many years. And I still don't think it's described properly to people. Meditation is just 100% neocortex. It's your thinking brain. There's no emotions allowed in your head. And that's why you think pure thoughts. And people talk about, this out of body experience, because your all senses are operating at their full capacity and you're at peace because there's no emotions. So meditating taught me, there, and I already knew from as a lieutenant, I was taught by my battalion commander at 2nd Ranger Battalion, who taught me when it happened to never get on the radio when you're emotional. Always take a deep breath and force yourself to talk calmly, because emotions are contagious. And if you get on and start yelling on the radio, whoever's hearing you is going to start ramping up their emotional reaction too. And so he taught me, always take a deep breath, and then, Alpha 1, this is Alpha 2, force yourself to talk slow and calm. And when you do both of those, you calm the way you act. And the reason is the only part of your brain that can take control of unconscious processes like breathing is your neocortex. So the first most effective thing to do when you want to, negate stress and get into that calm thinking state is to breathe. And we're talking diaphragmatic breathing, which is, belly breathing. And I teach people, put your hand on your stomach while you're doing it because it adds another sensory element. And then breathe deep through the nose. You should feel like a bowling ball pop out of your stomach and then blow out slowly with your mouth. And when you're doing that inside, it's massaging and moving your diaphragm. But more than that, it's your neocortex. The only way you can consciously breathe, is by engaging your neocortex. It's physically impossible to consciously breathe. And then the other part is speaking. The only part of your brain, our emotional brain, can't speak. That's why you can't describe an emotion with language. The only part of our brain that can speak is our thinking brain, our neocortex. So when you talk calmly and slowly, you calm the way you act. And it's because your neocortex is switched on and it's shutting down your emotional brain.
That's
and
great.
So in that moment, that would have been the best weapon, any of those guys could have used. And I want guys in the future, every soldier to know that. Every soldier should be trained. We teach them how to use their weapons, their commo, their nods, but we don't teach them anything about their most powerful weapon, which is their brain. And they need to know that. And I think it would have been a game changer if those guys could have de-stressed right there in the canyon.
And then if you could, Pete, could you just take us through kind of the last moments of this fight?
Yep. So, we went through the canyon. They were in there about 12 minutes, inching their way through, shooting the whole time. Remember, they're shooting to the north on the high ground. And for those of you who look at the maps and the video, you'll notice the cardinal directions are in there. So in their brain, the enemy is to the north on the high ground. When they finally come out of this slot canyon, it literally, the dry creek bed opens up, gets wide, and that's the first time they laid eye on the spur, the high ground where the other serial is. And right when they come out, the Afghan is shooting over that exact spot, or he's shooting down. We don't know for sure. He might have thought they were enemy, and he may have been shooting right at them, but he for sure was shooting right over them in the southerly direction. And he's an Afghan with a beard. That's all they can see. It's about 1840. So it's, we're minutes from being dark, maybe 10 to 12 minutes from being completely dark. That's the light level. They're moving, they're jumping up and down, they're cortically inhibited. That's stressed out, emotionally stressed out. They've been shooting for 12 minutes and, the shooting stopped. So it worked. They're alive. And, when I interviewed one of the gunners, machine gunners, he said, when we popped out, I wasn't like a nervous wreck. I had come to this conclusion. We did it. We got out. We suppressed their fire. So they're actually, positive. They had positive reinforcement in their heads that they weren't dead yet from shooting. Yet they come out, and right there on the spur is this Afghan shooting, and at least two of the Rangers of the 9 Rangers behind them are also still shooting, either at the northern high ground or south. So there's weapons reports. There's, the sound of weapons fire. They can just make out a human figure with a beard. And, anybody can tell the distinctive sound of an AK, especially compared to an M4. It's thumpity thump, 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 instead of, a much more shrill crack. And that's what's happening. And, that squad leader, as he comes out, if you went textbook ROE is, self-defense. And he's right there in the front seat, and his guys are behind him, and he just swung his ACOG around and shot, at this Afghan. And of course, this is where, things are now snowballing downhill. The guys behind him are trained to shoot wherever their squad leader shoots. So they swing, their machine guns, a 50 cal, an M240, a SAW, an M203, two M4s. They swing them around and start shooting at that general direction. That's Tillman and O'Neill are behind the Afghan. And so they think, wow, they got it mistake. They got it mixed up. Those are our guys. And these guys come out. It's very quick what happened. But as they come, there's a wall that runs along the edge of the dry creek bed, and it sits right in front of this spur. It's an actual poppy field that the wall's around. But to make the right turn, they had to dip in the creek bed. And when they dipped, the machine guns they didn't have line of sight at the spur, so they stopped shooting. And that, to Pat Tillman and the guy next to him, was, they figured it out. They know it's us. So they stood up and, started screaming and waving their arms again. But that's not what happened. Those guys just couldn't see. And as soon as the dry creek bed rose up again above the wall, they opened right back up. And those guys went right down. And even then they were making it. It was literally the last seconds of shooting from that lead Humvee where the SAW swung around, and the forensics show that it was the SAW that killed him, hit him in the head. But there were thousands of rounds up there, and so these guys who are now deaf pull over. An Afghan runs out, says ceasefire, ceasefire, and someone's already yelling, friendlies are up here, because now the radios are working, the line of sight. So you can hear Serial 1 saying, it's friendlies. And you could also hear, we got an eagle down, eagle down, KIA. And so the reporting starts. Now, remember, the platoon leader is out of action. He was hit by a mortar round in the opening moments of the firefight. Him and his RTO were hit by the same round, which we believe came from one of Serial 2's vehicles. The radio operator believes it was actually a 203 round that blew him and the platoon leader out of their position. And the platoon leader was more or less, mission incapable from that point forward. So the chaos is even added initially, but they stopped shooting. And now it's literally a minute and a half, 2 minutes from complete darkness. So there's only a couple minutes of light left. And they just start trying to figure out what's happening. No one knows, including the guys up on the spur, until the squad leader comes down, sees Tillman has been killed. The private next to him is despondent. He's screaming, it was our guys. They even shot us, and he's just upset like anyone would be who, when the guy next to him gets shot and killed. And so they begin trying to figure out what to do. And the first thing they have to do is secure the perimeter, because, there's still bad guys out there. So you've got to secure the area. You've got to get a medevac in there because, you got 2 KIA. They know the Afghan's dead now. And within a few minutes, they realized the platoon leader and his RTO had been hit by both mortar fire /40 millimeter and machine gun fire. And so they've got to get a medevac in to get the living guys out and a medevac in to get the dead guys out. And so it was at that point where it took almost 10 minutes for the rear element of Serial 2 to come out and park at the base of the spur. And that last vehicle out is Kevin Tillman. And nobody knows yet, even that Pat's dead, except that squad leader. So, Kevin goes into pulling security like everyone else. And no one's really telling him what happened. And that's because no one knew. The platoon sergeant's the next guy up there. He sees Tillman dead. He's, just takes a moment of devastation. But then he realizes we got to secure this area and we got to get these helicopters in here. So he goes to operational mode, expanding the perimeter, making sure no one else is wounded or killed, and calling in these medevacs. And that takes about 30 minutes to happen. During that time, a number of people noticed these other guys walking around. And I first noticed it in some of the statements. Someone was just talking about, the minutes after the firefight. And they say, and then I noticed one of the snipers who had arrived, and he was walking around. I'm like, one of the snipers arrived from where? And I, like, this was major thing because, your brain's going a million different directions, to include, were they involved in, shooting from the hill? Was it another mistaken thing? But it wasn't. It was the recon platoon who was out there driving without no one told them that second platoon, either serial was out there, and no one told serial 2 that the recon platoon was out there, because they were heading for Mana to get back to the same point on the highway where these guys were going to take their vehicle. So, the revelation there is that not only did this massive multi-million-dollar system of space-age TOCs not tell the platoon that they were about to converge, which they should have known through both satellite radio communication and the Blue Force trackers. So the Blue Force trackers were showing these dots coming together
watching
in this canyon, and they weren't told. So not only that, initially the excuse or the rationale to investigators was, we knew where they were at. It's just there was no way to talk to them, and they were not communicating with us. Their radios weren't properly, serviced, and pretty much blamed it on them. But when you find out another platoon was out there, my first reaction, which, I even asked the platoon sergeant about, could you guys have gotten to Mana and held it? He's like, of course. And he's like, the other thing was, we had 6 SATCOM radios and 6 UHF. All of them were working. We could have relayed anything for the platoon back to the TOC, but neither the TOC told us, and the platoon had no idea we were out there, and neither do we have an idea that they were there. So it's a big revelation. They were never interviewed in any of the 4 investigations. There's no mention of them. But what it proves is this, that this CFT massive TOC infrastructure not only didn't work, it's totally dysfunctional and worked against all these guys out there. So the recon platoon's a big help. It's guys who aren't stressed out. They're able to, help with the perimeter, help triage guys, set up the HLZ for the medevac aircraft, and add, a voice of reason to things. And so the helicopters come in, take out, the 2 KIA, Pat Tillman in the Afghan, and the 2 WIA in the other helicopter, to get them back to the critical care unit in Selarino. And they take off. That's about 1945. The platoon, many members of the platoon reported just adrenaline crashes. Like one guy, it's a funny story. He was standing there. I believe this is the FO, and he just turned to spaghetti and dropped to the ground and, collapsed. And the guy next to him was like, enemy, 4 o'clock. He thought he got hit by a sniper.
Oh, no.
And he's laying on the ground. He's like, I'm not him, man. I don't know what happened. And the medic runs over. He goes, you had an adrenaline crash, man. It's happening all over. But that is important. It's kind of funny, but it shows you the devastation, how much life had been sucked out of these guys through this circumstance. And that's combat. That happens. And, in normal crazy combat, you also deal with that. But here it just shows these guys, left everything on that battlefield in that firefight. And, the chain of command, the battalion commander doesn't come out till the next day. And he's only like a couple miles down the road.
Yeah.
He doesn't come out till almost 12 hours later to the site, which again, anti-patterns, those are my guys. I'm going right there. And I'm from the very beginning, when someone dies like that, a traumatic event, you got to bring that platoon back. You got to get them, find out what happens, but you got to like take care of them too, because, this is a devastating thing to anybody, but it can be overcome with just quick logic, quick support, like you said, sharing the truth. And that's when, things again began to unravel. The platoon gets called back to the rear. They came back the next night. They instantly kind of notice this is weird. No one's talking to us. No one's coming to us going, hey, what happened? So they are told to do a hot wash the second night back after he's been killed. And so they do this hot wash. And
hot wash, like after action review, lessons learned, discussion.
Yeah. And this was called a critical incident debrief, I think. So they do it, and it's an amazing thing because, and I talk about it in the book, the squad leaders get up and instantly take responsibility for everything. The squad leader number one was, here's what happened. I ran up to the spur to help these guys and make comms. Tillman and his fire team followed. He never would have followed if I hadn't gone up there to make comms and to try to support those guys. And he wouldn't have been out on that spur. The guy in the lead vehicle, I came around the corner. I saw that guy. I thought he was enemy. We've been shooting that way for, a long time. And I shot at him. And the guys behind me did what they're trained to do. You can't blame this on. He was already trying to take care of his guys, saying, they shot where I shot. I made the mistake. It was me who shot at that Afghan. And if I could do it again, I wouldn't shoot at him, but I did. And that caused the machine gun fire, to come down on everyone behind him. So these guys are taking responsibility. And as I point out, there's a big difference between taking responsibility and taking blame. Responsibility just shows you assume that you're accountable and you're responsible for the lives of the people. So you are, in that fact, responsible and answerable to what happened. Blame is when you accept it was your fault, and they knew it wasn't their fault, but they couldn't describe why, because they didn't know all these decisions that were being made in the background, the senselessness of them. They didn't know that their platoon leader tried to, change their mind with logic and was told, the time for good ideas is over. Do what you're told to do. They didn't know any of that stuff. And of course, they didn't know the recon platoon was right over there and could have done all this and could have assisted them the whole time. So, you've got this formula building, and at this point, it's 2 days after. Remember, the families and Kevin are not notified for 35 days after. But on the second night, after these guys take responsibility, and everyone knows it was friendly fire. He was caught up there. They're prying the 50 cal rounds out of the boulders. Everyone knows it. So all these guys are taking responsibility, including the gunners. They're like, God damn, it was us. We killed them. But they can't explain it. And after they come to the conclusion that night, that word gets passed up that chain of command at the speed of light. And it was me trying to understand why nobody answered the platoon sergeant. So I found out who one of the staff officers were in Iraq, and I contacted that guy. It took me a long time. And I contacted him and I said, hey, did you hear the radio transmissions that, Serial 2 was turning around? And he said, no, but I remember everything about that night. And I'm like, hey, tell me. And that's when he told me he was in the general's office, and the phone rang, and it was the 4-star from CENTCOM. And what he said to him after 5 minutes of talking was, hey, we killed him. It was fratricide, and we got to get in front of it. And that juxtaposition with these 23, 24-year-old American warrior patriots who've already taken responsibility for something that they did not, they weren't even responsible, in my opinion, for it, because they were put into that situation, forced into that situation in every way. And then, like I said, there was almost no way out by the time they're coming out of the canyon
No
and
way.
the serial ones on the spur, there was nothing to save anybody at that point. But it's this incredible juxtaposition. And my first response to that squad leader was, did he say anything about Kevin? Did he mention Kevin? Because I, the whole time, defaulted, to Kevin on this thing, even though I was doing this to answer his mom. To me, it was about him. And then they did a memorial service that same night that they did the hot wash, the after action. They did the memorial service for Pat, and taps played. Everyone stood at attention, saluted his casket. They put the casket on a CH-47, and Kevin went along with it with one Ranger to go back to Bagram and then accompany the body all the way back to the States. So the chain of command has a last chance with Kevin at Salerno. They already know, what happened. The platoon's already wrapped their heads around it. They've been out to the site. Everyone at the site said, yeah, pretty sure that they shot him. And they don't tell him. And, they tell investigators, we thought it was best that he didn't know. And so that would make that excuse for why he got, you let him get on the helicopter. But the second that general knew it in a strong enough way to tell a 4-star general, we killed him, it was fratricide, to not call the family is an unconscionable, in my opinion, violation of that contract we talked about. Anyone who's had someone die around them knows the first thing you ask is, where were they coming from? Well, I was at the car wash. Did he talk to anybody at the car wash? Did he talk to the cashier? I don't know. Well, I'm going to go back. I want to talk to that cashier. I want to see. You want to know every detail. It's human nature, because we want to learn and make sure that what happened for the reasons we're saying it. So to deny them for 35 days, you can only be doing that for one reason. You're hoping that it will just gloss over. No one will keep asking questions. And if we just escape, everyone's going to believe these guys effed up and just shot him. We got that. So let's just keep that and the rest of it on the download. And, we should be able to get out of this thing without any repercussions on us. And that's the only rationale I can come up with for why you do that. But they did it, and they talked for 35 days till they finally told the Tillman family. And so, to connect this forward, one of the things the book did, amazing experiences. And I'll sum it up by saying this: writing the book and the experience of it is one of the most rewarding things I've done in my whole military career. And it's because of that interaction with these guys and with the family. And after Mary Tillman read the book, and remember, she didn't read anything I was writing. She never wanted to see it till it was done. And when she read it, her and her brother called me and said, this is the first time since 2004 that we both now believe he wasn't murdered. And so for all those years, the only thing they could come up with was, the only reason they'd lie like that repeatedly is it had to be something really nefarious. And so they allowed their minds, which your mind will wander, wander toward that he was murdered. And so the book was the first time, because of the evidence in there and the common sense evidence, that they had closure. That it was, a tragic accident, but it was a tragic accident caused by this toxic leadership climate.
I got to say, just knowing your background, Pete, I have a feeling this didn't deter you at all, but I got to imagine you didn't make a ton of friends either writing this book. And probably some of the friends that you had, I don't know, they might not be sending you a Christmas card this year, is my guess, but you still did it.
Yeah, well, thanks. And, I had a bunch, as it was a 5-year journey, and I had a bunch of people saying that, other friends going, hey, man, you know what you're biting off, because that general is still very powerful. He's, in his civilian life, and he doesn't take, nicks to his perceived legacy well. And they kept saying, "Are you sure you're going to do this?" And I was like, "Guys, look at me. I don't have anything wrong with me. I'm living a fine life with my family. I got a good job. I'm not carrying anything around with me. These guys are still, this platoon's still taking casualties. This family has been devastated by not just what happened, but the way it was handled and what happened afterwards. Devastated, including her. She's cried on the phone to me. I can't tell you how many times. Very moving. And each time, all it did was harden my resolve. Same with the guys. As I talked to O'Neill, as I talked to the RTO who's in a rehab, VA rehab center in Kansas while I'm talking to him. And he should have gotten a Bronze Star with V for what he did. They found him on the radio calling in the medevac helicopters. The first time he was treated, he was on the radio vectoring in the medevac helicopters, and he had been blown up by a 40 millimeter round. So he had shrapnel neck and face. He'd been hit in the chest with a 7.62 round and shot in the knee with a 5.56 round. And he's on the radio calling in medevacs. And he's not complaining even to this day, but he's angry. And as I'm telling him stuff, he's like, "What? No, I didn't know that. Are you kidding me?" And showing him the pictures. "No, I never saw those pictures." Amazing. Telling him about the recon platoon. "Did you know this recon?" "No, I never knew that, or I would have called them. They would have been the first guys I would have called." So, by that point, like I would tell my friends the same thing. Yeah, I don't give a shit. Someone could come threaten my life, and I'm not going to change what I'm doing because it's the right thing to do. And I owe the mom and I owe these guys to tell this story, to tell the truth. And, after that, let the chips fall where they may. But, the journey of writing it, pulled me all in. There was no turning back. And, it's not even something I ever thought about. But so many people asked me that, I had to start answering just like you just did. I had to, tell them, the logic of why it just wasn't an issue to me.
I mean, I'm not surprised. I kind of knew that would be the case, but you can't, I'm sure you can't avoid having to have angered some people, but it's rightly done. One of the things that you brought up through this discussion that I hadn't heard much, especially on this show, and we'll bring this to a close here in just a moment, but somebody that we've interviewed twice before, I don't think you know him. His name is Christian Holloway. He's a former Marine who was in the invasion in 2003 as a rifleman, and then he was in MARSOC. I just re-interviewed him for another project that people haven't heard. So for folks who are listening, you haven't heard this yet, but he described, because we're so quick to talk about how great the camaraderie is in the military and these events, and we're not trying to glorify them on this show. It's just the reality of what this is like. But he pointed out that there was a particular unit that was involved in a fratricide. That he was not in the unit, but he was a sister unit at the time in MARSOC, and just how the negativity around that unit never went away. To this day, those guys don't stay together. They don't keep up. They carry so much animosity. And I think this is the second time I've heard it is the way you described it with some of these guys until they knew the truth and they could kind of let it go. So, it's a reminder, it's more of a balanced approach maybe there aren't a lot of those pockets, but they're there and it's worth calling out.
Totally. And I believe there's a lot of them out there. And that's why in the end, I recommend there needs to be studies on group PTSD. And this study needs to ask the questions, was it a toxic climate? Was there a toxic climate in place? Because usually the precursors are from that toxicity, the frustration, the anger, the inability to know what's really happening. That's the first thing. Was there a traumatic event and an investigation that followed? Because the traumatic event, what I would suspect on those Marines is it wasn't just the friendly fire. It was what happened afterwards and the polarization and ostracizing that goes on. Yeah. Because like here, the rest of, I believe, the battalion, got manipulated into doing the bidding for this chain of command who was
saving themselves,
the platoon. So the platoon were outcasts. They came back, they were outcasts, and that's natural human nature. Every platoon talks smack about every other platoon in the same unit. Every company about the other company, every battalion about the other battalion, every division about the other division. It's just a natural part of human nature. But this was different. They were, they embarrassed the regiment. This was a boondoggle. How could you have shot him? And a lot of it was because they bought off on that narrative that it was plenty of light. They were only, 75 meters away. How could you not see guys up waving their hands? Yeah. None of the information on deafness, on the foliage and the lava mottled nature of the rocks and the long shadows, how difficult it was to see up there, the lack of light, the fact that they were split apart from their organic teams. So it was just hodgepodges of guys in both groups, even though those organic teams were still in the two groups. They just weren't together. They had pulled them apart, shuffled them around, and then shoved them into a firefight. So I believe we need to look at that. We need to look to see if there's a relationship to the toxicity, see if there's a relationship to the way the units handle these traumatic events, because like that Marine unit, they may have handled it by that ostracization and the polarization and the negativity. And that, for proud guys is what will drive you into PTSD territory. So a lot to be learned from it. And, I'm glad you brought that up, because it's important that we don't just, say we learned a lesson. We need to now take it to the next step and do stuff to prevent it in the future.
I can't thank you enough, Pete. I will say, coming from the aviation community, they have a little bit of an advantage, sadly, of having, recorders when anything goes down and there's a crash, and they do such a good job of investigating, and you listen to the last moments that somebody had to try to learn from that. And I don't know how often it happens in the infantry, but this is like such a great case study. So for people who are looking, we'll have all the links in the description, but Common Sense Leadership Matters, Toxic Leadership Destroys, a case study. And it's just one of many books that they can pick up from you, Pete. And we'll have the link so you can see all the video and imagery, and you can really feel like you're there as you're listening. Thank you so much for what you did and for taking the time with us.
Thank you, Ryan. I totally enjoyed it, and look forward to seeing what you put up.
I hope you enjoyed this combat story. It was great to sit down with Pete again. So many people saw that first interview, and I was always struck by how calm he was during that interview. And I think the more we hear about how much he's done research-wise into stress, how to remain calm in the moment, what he was taught and has learned since, makes sense. And I really hope you enjoyed that one as much as I did. That was great. What a testament to Pete and the work he did for all these people out there, for all of us, but especially Pat's family. With that, couple listener comments. I went back to the Pete Blaber interview, number 73, to just pull a couple. And first one's from one of our subscribers. I think it's OG Pigeon 4431. He says, "These stories are absolutely amazing. Thanks for putting these together, sir." And the second one is from Much 17. He says, "Just finished The Men, the Mission, and Me," which is one of Pete's other books. He said, "It is pretty darn good." And I would just echo that, like reading through this most recent one about Tillman. I think most people who listen to Combat Story for the insight and what it's really like will really appreciate this book. It's a ton of inside baseball with people in the special ops community and several who either were in or would go on to be part of the unit. So great insight, like really tactical insight and strategic as well. And then the last one is a 5-star review on Apple Podcast. It's from a name I just can't even pronounce, but it says, "Bruh, this is the best podcast ever. So any people who think this podcast is rated at a 4-star or below, shut up and put up a 5-star. So I really appreciate that. It means a ton to me. Gets this out in front of more people, which is really what we're trying to do. And I just want to say thanks for sticking it out. This was a long one, but needed to be for the content. So thank you all for your support, and stay safe.